By the late 5th century, the once vast Roman Empire had shrunk to the Greek-speaking eastern provinces, where Christianity had fully replaced the ancient gods of Greece and Rome. The empire's heart now beat in Asia Minor, and its people, though Greek in language and culture, called themselves Romaios, meaning Roman rather than Hellene, a word that had come to signify paganism. In Constantinople, citizens proudly referred to themselves as Byzantines, marking the beginning of a new era. Modern historians view this moment as the turning point when the Roman Empire transformed into the Byzantine Empire. Centuries later, the theologian Gennadius would summarize this shift, saying, "Though I speak as a Greek, I am not a Hellene, for I do not believe as they believe. I call myself a Christian and a Byzantine, for I am of Byzantium." When Emperor Marcian died in 457, the empire once again lacked a clear successor. The Senate offered the throne to the powerful General Aspar, but he declined and instead nominated his subordinate, Leo, a Thracian from Dacia. Leo became emperor, crowned by the Patriarch of Constantinople, and for several years remained under Aspar's influence, while the army was still dominated by barbarian mercenaries. To counter this, Leo enlisted the Isaurians, a fierce mountain people from southern Anatolia, under their leader Tarasicodisa, who adopted the name Zeno. Leo strengthened this alliance by marrying his daughter Ariadne to Zeno. When Leo died, his young grandson Leo II briefly inherited the throne before passing away, leaving Zeno as emperor in 474. His 17-year reign marked the final collapse of Roman power in the West, making him sole ruler of the remaining empire. After Zeno's death in 491, the throne passed to Anastasius, a 60-year-old official from Dyrrachium, who soon married Zeno's widow, Ariadne. Though initially welcomed for his Greek heritage, his strict moral reforms and support for Monophysite Christianity provoked unrest and riots in Constantinople. His long rule was plagued by invasions and revolts. The Bulgars raided as far as the city's outskirts, forcing Anastasius to build the mighty Long Walls, a defensive line stretching 40 miles from the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara. He also faced renewed conflict with Persia, but by 505 he secured peace that would last more than 20 years. Anastasius died in 518 at the age of 88, leaving no heir. Power passed to Justin, an illiterate but capable general from Illyria, chosen by the army and supported by his ambitious nephew, Justinian. Though Justin could neither read nor write, he ruled effectively with Justinian as his advisor. By 527, Justinian had been named co-emperor alongside his wife Theodora, a former actress who would become one of the most influential women in Byzantine history. Upon Justin's death that same year, Justinian became sole ruler, fully prepared for the task after a decade in power. He dreamed of restoring the glory of ancient Rome, vowing to reclaim lost territories and reunite the empire under Christian rule. Justinian's reign was chronicled by Procopius of Caesarea, often called the last great historian of antiquity. As the personal secretary of General Belisarius, Procopius witnessed campaigns in Persia, North Africa, and Italy, later recording them in his History of the Wars and his account of Justinian's vast building projects, the edifices. Soon after ascending the throne, Justinian reformed the empire's legal system. In 534, he completed the Codex Justinianus, which, along with his later decrees, formed the Corpus Juris Civilis, the foundation of European law for centuries to come. Equally determined in matters of faith, Justinian sought to enforce Christian orthodoxy and eradicate the remnants of paganism. He closed the ancient philosophical schools of Greece, banning non-Christians from teaching. The great Platonic Academy of Athens, founded nearly 900 years earlier, was finally shut down, ending a golden age of Greek philosophy. Its last scholars, including Damasius, Simplicius, and Isidorus of Miletus, fled to Persia, where they found refuge under King Khosroes I before eventually returning to Byzantine lands. Meanwhile, Justinian's general Belisarius led successful campaigns in the east. After initial clashes, a peace treaty known as the Endless Peace was signed with Persia in 531. With stability restored, Justinian now turned his attention westward, setting out to reclaim the lost provinces of the Roman world, an ambition that would define his reign and shape the future of the Byzantine Empire. 5 years after Justinian became emperor, his reign faced its greatest crisis, the Nika Revolt. It began on January 10, 532, as a riot between rival factions in the Hippodrome, but quickly grew into a full-scale rebellion. Within days, the mob united under the cry Nika, meaning conquer, and stormed the gates of the Great Palace, setting much of Constantinople ablaze. The famous churches of Hagia Sophia and Hagia Irene were reduced to ashes. Terrified, Justinian's advisors urged him to flee to Thrace and regroup, but it was Empress Theodora's defiant words that changed everything. She reminded her husband that imperial dignity was worth more than life itself, declaring that royalty is a fine burial shroud. Inspired by her courage, Justinian resolved to fight. His general Belisarius led imperial troops into the Hippodrome, trapping and slaughtering an estimated 30,000 rebels, ending the insurrection in a single, brutal stroke. In the aftermath of this bloody victory, Justinian turned his focus to rebuilding the empire's capital. Only 40 days after the revolt, he began reconstructing Hagia Sophia on a scale grander than ever before, determined to make it the greatest church in Christendom. He spared no expense, summoning the finest craftsmen and architects from across the empire. The project was led by Anthemius of Tralles and Isidorus of Miletus, two brilliant mathematicians and engineers. In just 6 years, their masterpiece was complete. On December 26, 537, Justinian and Theodora attended the grand dedication, where the emperor is said to have exclaimed, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." During the same period, Justinian also rebuilt Hagia Irene and the Church of the Holy Apostles, adding a magnificent new mausoleum for the imperial family. Meanwhile, Justinian pursued his dream of restoring the lost Roman world. In 533, he sent his trusted general Belisarius to North Africa to confront the Vandals. The campaign was swift and decisive. Near Carthage, Belisarius crushed the Vandal army, captured their king Gelimer, and restored the region to imperial control. 2 years later, Justinian dispatched Belisarius again, this time to Italy to reclaim the lands held by the Ostrogoths. Rome was taken in 536, though the victory was short-lived, as the Ostrogoths counterattacked under their king Vitiges. Belisarius endured a long siege, but eventually broke free with reinforcements led by the eunuch general Narses. After years of fighting, the Gothic stronghold of Ravenna fell in 540, marking another triumph for the empire. However, as Belisarius campaigned in the west, the Persian king Khosroes I seized the opportunity to break the peace. In the spring of 540, Persian forces invaded Syria, sacking Antioch and taking thousands into captivity. Justinian recalled Belisarius to the east, launching another long and costly war that would last 20 years. During this same period, Italy was again thrown into chaos as the Goths, led by Totila, rose in revolt. They recaptured Rome in 546, but Belisarius returned to reclaim it the following year. When he was recalled once more, Narses took command and won 2 decisive victories in 552, finally ending Gothic resistance. Justinian's armies also gained a foothold in Spain, capturing the province of Cartagena and the surrounding territories. By the end of these campaigns, Justinian's empire nearly encircled the Mediterranean, uniting much of the old Roman world under his rule. Procopius, in his edifices, describes the emperor's innumerable fortresses, churches, and public works built throughout his dominion. Among these was the Grand Basilica of St. John the Theologian in Ephesus, modeled on the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople. The long Persian War finally ended in 562 with a treaty guaranteeing 50 years of peace and the return of Lazica to Roman control. In his later years, Justinian focused on restoration rather than conquest. When earthquakes damaged Hagia Sophia, he ordered its repair, and the great church was rededicated on Christmas Eve, 563. The emperor continued to work tirelessly until his sudden death on November 14, 565, at the age of 83. He was laid to rest beside Theodora in the mausoleum he had built in the Church of the Holy Apostles. Though some chroniclers hailed his reign as the most glorious in Byzantine history, others, like Evagrius, saw it as an age of endless turmoil and divine reckoning. Justinian's era was also a time of remarkable intellectual brilliance. His court attracted some of the greatest minds of late antiquity, including the architects of Hagia Sophia, Anthemius of Tralles, and Isidorus of Miletus. Both were mathematicians and physicists whose innovations helped shape the science of engineering. Anthemius, the son of a physician from Tralles, became a professor of geometry in Constantinople and was famed for applying mathematical theory to real-world invention. His surviving works include treatises on burning mirrors and mechanical devices, one describing how he used steam pressure and mirrors to imitate earthquakes and lightning, a clever prank designed to terrify his noisy neighbor. Isidorus of Miletus, born in the ancient Ionian city that had once produced the pioneering philosophers Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, was one of the most brilliant minds of Justinian's age. Educated at the Platonic Academy in Athens, he later became its third-to-last director before the school was closed by imperial decree. After a period of exile in Persia, Isidorus was invited to Constantinople by Justinian, where his expertise in mathematics and engineering helped shape one of history's greatest architectural achievements, the Dome of Hagia Sophia. He was also responsible for compiling the first complete edition of Archimedes' works, preserving treatises such as On the Sphere and Cylinder, On the Measurement of the Circle, and On the Equilibrium of Planes. His commentary on Vaulting by the inventor Hero of Alexandria directly influenced the daring design of Hagia Sophia's vast dome, which, as Procopius described, appeared to hang from the heavens themselves. During Justinian's reign, Asia Minor produced a new generation of historians, poets, and scholars. Among them was Agathias of Myrina, a historian and poet who studied in Athens and Constantinople. He practiced law in the capital and wrote a continuation of Procopius' History of the Wars, though he only covered the years 553 to 559 before his death. His writings are especially valuable for their account of the reconstruction of Hagia Sophia after the earthquakes of 553 and 557. Agathias also compiled a collection of epigrams known as the Cycle of Agathias, which includes many of his own verses and those of his contemporaries, reflecting both wit and emotion. One of the poets featured in the collection was Paul the Silentiary, who served as an usher in Hagia Sophia, responsible for maintaining silence during the liturgy. Paul wrote numerous epigrams, but is best remembered for his magnificent poem celebrating the rededication of Hagia Sophia on Christmas Eve in 563. In it, he described the radiant beauty of the church's vast dome, comparing its light to that of the legendary lighthouse of Alexandria, guiding travelers across both the sea and the spiritual realm. His verses evoke the idea that Hagia Sophia itself was a beacon of divine illumination, leading humanity toward God. The southern provinces of Asia Minor also produced two towering intellectuals, the jurist Tribonian and the philosopher Simplicius. Tribonian, born in the Pamphylian city of Side, studied law in Constantinople and became the empire's most celebrated legal scholar. A close friend and trusted advisor of Justinian, he led the commission that compiled the Codex Justinianus, the foundation of Byzantine and later European law. Despite his brilliance, Tribonian faced temporary disgrace during the Nika Revolt when he was accused of corruption and dismissed, though he later returned to imperial service. Simplicius of Cilicia represented the last great flowering of pagan philosophy. Educated in Alexandria and Athens under Damasius, the final head of the Platonic Academy, he was forced into exile after Justinian's decree banning pagan teaching. Finding refuge in Persia, he later returned to Athens to continue his studies in private. Simplicius devoted his life to writing commentaries on Aristotle, which became vital sources of philosophical thought in medieval Europe and deeply influenced the scholars of the early Renaissance. After Justinian's death in 565, his nephew Justin II ascended the throne with his wife Sophia, the niece of Theodora. His reign, however, was plagued by disaster. In the first year of his rule, the Lombards swept through northern Italy, followed by the loss of Byzantine Spain to the Visigoths and invasions by the Avars in the Balkans. Around the same time, Slavic tribes advanced through Thrace and Macedonia, eventually sacking Athens and leaving it in ruins. Justin further weakened the empire by refusing to pay the annual tribute to the Persian king Khosroes, provoking a devastating war that led to the fall of the fortress city of Dara in 573. The shock drove Justin into madness, and real power passed to his capable general Tiberius, whom he appointed Caesar. When Justin died in 578, Tiberius became emperor and ruled until his death in 582, after which the Cappadocian general Maurus took the throne. Maurus proved to be an able ruler and strategist, securing peace with Persia through a treaty with Khosroes II that granted Byzantium control over much of eastern Armenia. He reorganized the empire's western territories, forming the exarchates of Ravenna and Carthage to preserve Byzantine influence in Italy and North Africa. Yet in 602, the army on the Danube revolted under a centurion named Phocas, who overthrew Maurus and executed him along with his 5 sons. The empire plunged into chaos. The Persians took advantage of the turmoil, conquering Mesopotamia, Syria, and Palestine, before advancing deep into Asia Minor, reaching as far as the Bosphorus opposite Constantinople. Inside the capital, riots and repression followed one another, while the Avars and Slavs devastated the Balkans, and the Lombards seized more land in Italy. The empire seemed doomed until salvation came from Africa. Heraclius, the exarch of Carthage, sent a fleet under his son, also named Heraclius, to Constantinople. On October 3, 610, the fleet entered the city, sparking a popular uprising that toppled Phocas, who was executed shortly afterward. 2 days later, Heraclius was crowned emperor by the Patriarch of Constantinople, marking the beginning of one of Byzantium's most remarkable reigns. Heraclius inherited an empire on the brink of collapse. The Persians had captured Jerusalem in 613, slaughtering its Christian population and carrying off the True Cross as a trophy. 2 years later, their armies overran Asia Minor, advancing once more to the shores of the Bosphorus. By 620, nearly all of the empire's eastern territories, Cilicia, Mesopotamia, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and most of Armenia, had fallen to Persian control. Meanwhile, the Avars ravaged the Balkans and reached the outskirts of Constantinople, only to be stopped by the mighty Theodosian walls. They withdrew, taking with them hundreds of thousands of captives from Thrace. By the early 7th century, the Byzantine Empire stood on the brink of collapse. The Persians had overrun much of its territory. The Avars and Slavs were devastating the Balkans, and Emperor Heraclius faced the possibility of losing everything. In desperation, he even considered abandoning Constantinople and moving the imperial capital to Carthage. The news caused panic in the city, and the Patriarch Sergius pleaded with him to stay, making Heraclius swear before God that he would not forsake his people. Sergius then took a bold step. He offered the immense wealth of the church to fund a last great campaign to save the empire. With this support, Heraclius began to rebuild and reorganize his army, transforming his struggle into what many saw as a holy war for the survival of Christian civilization. Heraclius made peace with the Avars so he could turn all his attention eastward against the Persians. In 622, he launched a daring counteroffensive, defeating them in Armenia. Over the next few years, he continued to campaign across eastern Anatolia, winning a series of victories that restored hope to the empire. Yet the Persian king, Chosroes II, refused to surrender and struck back with one final massive invasion. In 626, Persian forces reached Chalcedon on the Bosphorus, while the Avars and their Slavic allies attacked Constantinople from the land side. For weeks, the city was under siege, and at one desperate moment the attackers nearly broke through the Theodosian walls near Blachernae, where an ancient holy spring dedicated to the Virgin Mary stood. According to the Byzantines, a miraculous vision of the Virgin appeared above the walls, inspiring the defenders to drive the enemy back. When the siege finally broke, the people of Constantinople gathered in Blachernae to give thanks. Led by Patriarch Sergius, they sang a hymn of gratitude to the Virgin, the Akathistos hymn, which has since been sung every year in Orthodox churches to commemorate the city's deliverance. Meanwhile, Heraclius continued his campaign against Persia, culminating in a decisive victory on December 12, 626. Shortly afterward, Chosroes was overthrown and executed by his own son, Kavad II, who quickly sought peace. Under the terms of the treaty, all the territories lost since 602, including Armenia, Mesopotamia, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, were returned to Byzantine rule. Heraclius, now hailed as the savior of the empire, returned to Constantinople in triumph, carrying with him the relic of the True Cross, which the Persians had stolen years before. Yet even as the empire celebrated its miraculous recovery, a new and far more powerful force was rising in the Arabian deserts. In 622, the Prophet Muhammad had fled from Mecca to Medina, marking the beginning of the Islamic era. Within little more than a decade, the armies of Islam would sweep across the Middle East with astonishing speed. In 636, at the Battle of Yarmouk near Damascus, a Byzantine army commanded by Heraclius's brother Theodorus was utterly destroyed by the Arabs, opening Syria and Palestine to conquest. 2 years later, Jerusalem fell, and by 641, Alexandria, the jewel of Byzantine Egypt, had been taken as well. By this time, Heraclius was an old and broken man. The triumph that had once restored the empire now seemed like a fleeting illusion, undone by a new tide of faith and power rising from Arabia. The emperor who had saved Byzantium from annihilation lived just long enough to witness the beginning of its next great struggle, the Islamic conquests. On February 11th, 641, Heraclius died in Constantinople, weary and defeated in spirit. He was buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles beside his predecessors, from Constantine to Justinian, closing one of the most dramatic and heroic chapters in the history of the Byzantine Empire. After the death of Heraclius, his descendants ruled the Byzantine Empire for more than a century, a period marked by relentless invasions, internal strife, and the struggle for survival. The empire, now surrounded by enemies on all sides, stood as the last remaining bastion of Greco-Roman civilization. With Rome and Athens long fallen, only Constantinople endured, a shining fortress of faith and learning amid the darkness of the early Middle Ages. The Arab invasions began soon after Heraclius's death. In 641, under the child emperor Constans II, the Muslims launched their first attacks on Anatolia. Though only 11 years old, Constans was supported by capable generals who managed to hold the front until he came of age. In 651, he personally led a campaign against the Arabs in Armenia and the Caucasus, achieving limited victories. Meanwhile, the Slavs had swept across the Balkans, transforming much of Thrace into what the Byzantines now called Sclavinia. Constans subdued many of them and relocated their warriors to Asia Minor, where they were conscripted into the Byzantine army. When civil war broke out among the Arabs between Caliph Ali and the Syrian governor Muawiyah, Constans took advantage of the chaos to secure peace with Muawiyah and reorganize his empire's defenses. He divided Anatolia into military districts known as themes, each commanded by a strategos or general. These themes, Opsician, Armeniac, Anatolic, Thracizian, and Carabizian, became the backbone of Byzantine defense and administration for centuries. Soldiers in each theme were granted land in return for military service, creating a system that ensured both loyalty and readiness. After Constance's assassination, his son Constantine IV inherited the throne. He spent most of his reign fighting off new Arab assaults. In 674, a massive Arab fleet besieged Constantinople, but Constantine unveiled a terrifying new weapon, Greek fire, a flammable liquid that could burn even on water. The Byzantines unleashed it upon the enemy fleet, destroying it completely. The failed siege of 678 marked a turning point. The Arabs withdrew and even agreed to pay tribute to Byzantium, acknowledging its resilience. Constantine's successors, however, faced renewed troubles. His son Justinian II proved ambitious but reckless. He fought the Arabs with some success, but his cruelty and arrogance alienated the army. In 695, he was overthrown, mutilated, and exiled, only to return 10 years later, reclaim his throne, and rule until his violent death in 711. His fall ended the Heraclean dynasty, giving way to years of chaos as short-lived rulers rose and fell until 717, when Leo III, known as the Isaurian, seized power and founded a new dynasty. Almost immediately, the Arabs returned, laying siege to Constantinople in 717 with an enormous army and fleet. For a year, they battered the city walls, but famine, disease, and a harsh winter decimated them. The Byzantine defenders, again wielding Greek fire, annihilated what remained. The Great Arab Retreat of 718 marked the final failure of their attempt to conquer Europe from the east, just as, years later, Charles Martel would stop them from advancing through the west at Poitiers. Leo III's reign brought both stability and turmoil. In 726, he ignited one of Byzantium's most divisive controversies, the iconoclastic crisis. Believing that the veneration of holy images encouraged idolatry, he ordered the removal of a great image of Christ from the palace gates. Riots broke out, but Leo doubled down, banning icons across the empire in 730. Religious art was destroyed, and monasteries were persecuted. Yet Leo was also a reformer. He reorganized the empire's provinces and issued the Ecloga, a revised legal code written in Greek, signaling the final decline of Latin in the East. Leo was succeeded by his son Constantine V, who continued both the empire's wars and its war on icons. His rule was long and militarily successful, but marked by brutality toward monks and icon worshippers. He was followed by his son, Leo IV, whose Athenian wife, Irene, secretly supported the veneration of icons. After Leo's death in 780, their son Constantine VI became emperor under Irene's regency. Once in power, she immediately began restoring the worship of images, culminating in the Seventh Ecumenical Council at Nicaea in 787, which officially reinstated icons in Christian worship. Irene's rule, however, was not without intrigue. When her son grew older, he tried to assert independence, but his arrogance and cruelty turned the army and the church against him. In 797, Irene struck back, having her own son captured and blinded, an act so brutal it cost him his life. With his death, Irene became the sole ruler of the Byzantine Empire, the first woman in history to hold the imperial throne in her own right. Her reign caught the attention of the newly crowned Western Emperor, Charlemagne, who sent envoys to propose marriage, a union that might have reunited the divided halves of the Roman world. But before any such alliance could take place, Irene was overthrown in a palace coup in 802 by her finance minister, who ascended as Nicephorus I. Irene was exiled to the island of Lesbos, where she died soon after, ending one of the most extraordinary and turbulent chapters in Byzantine history, a century that saw the empire nearly destroyed, miraculously saved, and profoundly transformed. After the fall of Irene, the empire entered a turbulent yet transformative age under a succession of warrior emperors, reformers, and scholars. Nicephorus I, who seized the throne in 802, spent most of his reign waging wars against the Arabs, Slavs, and Bulgars. His campaigns ended in tragedy in 811, when he marched against the Bulgar Khan Krum, capturing his capital, Pliska, but walking straight into an ambush soon after. The Byzantine army was wiped out, Nicephorus was killed, and his skull was turned into a drinking cup by Krum, a grim symbol of the empire's peril. His wounded son, Stauricius, briefly succeeded him, but died within months, and the throne passed to his brother-in-law, Michael Rangabe. Michael's rule was short and disastrous. In 813, he was defeated by Crum near Adrianople and fled to Constantinople, where he abdicated in favor of Leo the Armenian, who became Leo V. That same year, Crum besieged Constantinople, but the city's mighty Theodosian walls held firm. Once peace was restored, Leo revived the old policy of iconoclasm, banning religious images and ordering their removal from churches. On Christmas Day, 820, Leo was assassinated during a church service by followers of his former ally, Michael the Amorian, who took the throne as Michael II, founding the Amorian dynasty that would last nearly a century. Michael II was succeeded in 829 by his son Theophilus, a young and energetic emperor who devoted much of his reign to campaigns against the Arabs. Though a moderate iconoclast, Theophilus was admired for his sense of justice and for strengthening the empire's defenses. His wife, Theodora, secretly remained faithful to the veneration of icons and would later play a pivotal role in restoring them. When Theophilus died in 842, their 2-year-old son, Michael III, became emperor, and Theodora ruled as regent alongside her brother Bardas. In 845, she officially ended the long and bitter iconoclastic controversy by restoring the veneration of icons, an event still commemorated in the Orthodox Church as the Feast of Orthodoxy. Michael III, known to history as the Sot for his love of drink and excess, neglected his imperial duties in favor of pleasure. His capable uncle Bardas managed the empire in his stead, leading successful campaigns against the Arabs and revitalizing Byzantine intellectual life. Bardas reopened the University of Constantinople after nearly 3 centuries of darkness, launching a cultural and scholarly renaissance. Under his patronage, great thinkers flourished: the theologian Photius, the philosopher Leo, and the missionary brothers Cyril and Methodius, who created the Slavonic script and spread Christianity to the Slavs. In 867, Michael III was murdered by his close companion and favorite, Basil the Macedonian, who immediately crowned himself emperor. His rise marked the beginning of the powerful Macedonian dynasty, which ruled the Byzantine Empire for nearly 200 years. This era became one of the most prosperous and culturally vibrant in Byzantine history, though it was also shaped by intrigue and the presence of ambitious generals who seized power through force or alliance. Among these military rulers were 2 Armenian-born emperors, Nicephorus II Phocas and John I Tzimisces, both of whom restored the empire's strength through decisive victories over the Arabs. They paved the way for Basil II, one of Byzantium's greatest rulers, whose reign from 976 to 1025 marked the empire's military zenith. After decades of relentless warfare, Basil crushed the Bulgars so completely that he was immortalized as Bulgaroctonus, the Bulgar Slayer. Under his reign, the Byzantine Empire stretched from southern Italy to the Caucasus and from the Danube to Syria, achieving its greatest territorial extent in centuries. Basil's death in 1025 ended an age of conquest. His brother and successor, Constantine VIII, was more interested in luxury than leadership. Having spent 50 years as co-emperor without ever ruling, he left no capable heir. The empire then passed into the hands of a series of short-lived rulers, Romanus III, Michael IV, and Michael V, who came to power through marriage or adoption by Constantine's daughter Zoe. After Michael V's downfall, Zoe ruled briefly alone before marrying Constantine IX Monomachus, whose reign brought a final burst of intellectual brilliance to the Macedonian era. Constantine IX revived the University of Constantinople in 1045, appointing the philosopher Michael Psellus as consul of the philosophers and John Xiphilinus as guardian of the law. This rebirth of classical Greek learning marked the height of Byzantine humanism. Psellus himself, one of the most eloquent minds of his age, described his education as a journey guided by mentors who ultimately led him to Aristotle and Plato. Under his influence, the empire saw a revival of Greek philosophy and rhetoric, blending the wisdom of antiquity with the faith and intellectual vigor of Byzantium, a final golden light before the coming storms of the medieval world. In the final year of Constantine IX's reign, a dispute erupted that would permanently divide Christendom. The conflict began between Pope Leo IX in Rome and Patriarch Michael Cerularius in Constantinople, each accusing the other of heresy and corruption. Tensions escalated until the summer of 1054, when an extraordinary scene unfolded inside the Grand Basilica of Hagia Sophia. During an afternoon service on July 16th, Cardinal Humbert, one of the papal envoys sent from Rome, walked boldly down the aisle and placed a document on the high altar, a papal bull formally excommunicating Cerularius and all his supporters. The congregation was stunned, and in retaliation, the Patriarch called a synod that declared the papal legates excommunicated as well. Thus, in a single day, the great schism between the Greek Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches was sealed, a division that has endured for nearly 1,000 years. By this time, Constantine's co-ruler, Zoe, had already passed away in 1050, leaving him to govern alone until his death 5 years later. When Constantine IX died in 1055, the throne passed to Zoe's sister, Theodora, the last surviving member of the Macedonian dynasty. She was about 75 years old, yet still sharp and commanding. Despite her age, she ruled decisively, refusing to share authority or appoint a successor. Her ministers, aware that her health was fragile, pleaded with her to name an heir to ensure stability. Late in August 1056, Theodora suddenly fell gravely ill, suffering intense abdominal pain. Realizing the end was near, she reluctantly agreed to the council's choice, an elderly bureaucrat named Michael Bringas, as her successor. She died that very day, on August 31st, and Bringas was immediately proclaimed emperor as Michael VI. With Theodora's death, the long and glorious Macedonian dynasty came to an end after nearly 2 centuries of rule. Beginning with her ancestor Basil I in the 9th century, the Macedonian emperors had transformed Byzantium into a mighty empire, stretching from Persia to Italy and from the Danube to the Aegean. Under their leadership, Constantinople became not only the political heart of the East, but also the shining center of art, learning, and philosophy, a beacon of classical civilization at a time when much of Europe had fallen into darkness. The end of Theodora's reign marked the close of Byzantium's golden age, a turning point after which the empire's fortunes would slowly begin to wane. The reign of Michael VI was short and troubled, lasting less than a year. In 1057, angered by his constant criticism, the generals of the Byzantine army decided to replace him with one of their own. They chose Isaac Comnenus, the commander-in-chief, who was proclaimed emperor by the army in Anatolia on June 8th. When news reached Constantinople, the Senate forced Michael to abdicate, and he fled to the sanctuary of Hagia Sophia. Soon afterward, He was allowed to retire peacefully to a monastery, where he died shortly after. Isaac Comnenus entered Constantinople triumphantly on September 1st, 1057, greeted with great enthusiasm by the people. Once in power, he immediately began reforming the government and strengthening the army, which had been long neglected. He restored discipline and defended the empire's frontiers in both Europe and Asia, holding back the Magyars and defeating the Patzinaks, a nomadic Turkic people who had crossed the Danube. However, his career was cut short when he contracted pneumonia in 1059 and was forced to name a successor before his death. Although his brother John seemed the natural choice, the military aristocracy convinced Isaac to choose one of their own, Constantine Ducas, who was crowned Constantine X in November 1059. Isaac retired to a monastery and died the following year. Constantine X, however, lacked the strength and leadership of his predecessor. He relied heavily on his brother John Ducas and his ambitious wife, the Empress Eudocia Macrembolitissa, a woman described as intelligent and strikingly beautiful. Constantine neglected the army, replacing disciplined soldiers with unreliable mercenaries, while corruption returned to the administration. As a result, the empire was left dangerously weakened at a time of new threats. The Normans under Robert Guiscard were conquering southern Italy, and the Seljuk Turks, after taking Persia, had begun raiding deep into Anatolia. When Constantine fell ill, he named his teenage son Michael as his heir, with Eudocia serving as regent. He died in May 1067, leaving the empire in crisis. Eudocia ruled for only a few months before marrying the general Romanus Diogenes, a capable soldier she hoped could defend the empire. On January 1st, 1068, Romanus was crowned as Emperor Romanus IV, ruling jointly with her son, Michael VII. Romanus quickly reorganized the army and launched campaigns against the advancing Seljuks in 1068 and 1069. But in the summer of 1071, disaster struck. Leading a vast army eastward, Romanus met the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan near the town of Manzikert. On August 26th, the Byzantine army was utterly crushed, and Romanus himself was captured. Though Alp Arslan released him after he promised a heavy ransom, the emperor was soon deposed upon his return. He was exiled to a monastery on the Prince's Isles, where he died the following year. Michael VII continued to rule until 1078, when he was overthrown by the general Nicephorus Botaniates, who entered Constantinople and was crowned as Nicephorus III. His rule, too, was short-lived. In 1081, he was deposed by the young and ambitious general Alexius Comnenus, nephew of the former Emperor Isaac I, who re-established the Comnenian dynasty. Alexius was only 24, and his wife, the noble Irene Ducas, was barely 15. Together they would become the founders of a new imperial era, and their daughter, Anna Comnena, would one day chronicle their reign in the famous Alexiad. When Alexius came to power, the empire was surrounded by danger. The Seljuks had seized most of Anatolia, forming the Sultanate of Rum with its capital at Nicaea, while in the west, the Normans under Robert Guiscard invaded Greece. Guiscard's death in 1085 ended that threat, but Alexius then faced new invasions from the Patzinaks and Cumans, as well as an attack by the Turkish fleet of Chaka of Smyrna. Using the dreaded weapon known as Greek fire, the Byzantine navy destroyed the enemy fleet, while Alexius crushed the Patzinaks on land. He then forged an alliance with the Seljuk Sultan Kılıç Arslan, convincing him to eliminate Chaka. thus securing the empire's safety for a time. But the Byzantine position in Asia Minor remained dire. In 1095, Alexius sent envoys to Pope Urban II, pleading for Western aid against the Turks. The Pope responded later that year with a dramatic call for a crusade to liberate the Eastern Christians and reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. The First Crusade began soon after. The first wave to reach Constantinople was a disorganized mob of peasants led by Peter the Hermit. Seeing their lack of discipline, Alexius urged them to wait near Nicomedia until professional crusaders arrived. Instead, the undisciplined crowd marched ahead, looting Byzantine towns, only to be slaughtered by the Turks. The few survivors were rescued and sheltered outside Constantinople by Alexius, marking the dramatic and chaotic beginning of the crusading era that would forever change both Byzantium and the medieval world. The first organized crusader armies reached Constantinople in the autumn of 1096. The first group was led by Hugh of Vermandois, brother of the French king, and was followed by others over the next months, including a contingent commanded by Bohemund of Taranto, son of Robert Guiscard. Emperor Alexius, after tense negotiations and occasional violence, persuaded all the crusader leaders to swear oaths of loyalty to him, promising to return any former Byzantine lands they might capture from the Turks. Their first major target was Nicaea, the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. When the crusaders surrounded the city, Sultan Kılıç Arslan hurried back from his campaign in the east, where he had been fighting the Danişmendid Turks. But it was too late. The crusaders defeated his forces outside the city, and the garrison surrendered, not to them, but to Alexius's Byzantine commanders, who skillfully outmaneuvered the Western armies diplomatically. After Nicaea, the crusaders marched across Anatolia toward the Holy Land. Bohemund's troops led the way, followed by Raymond of Saint-Gilles and others. On July 1st, 1097, near Dorylaeum, Kılıç Arslan ambushed Bohemund's army, nearly surrounding and destroying it. But at midday, Raymond's second force arrived, turning the tide and forcing the Turks to retreat. Recognizing the superior discipline and strength of the Crusaders, Kılıç Arslan changed tactics, ordering the countryside stripped of supplies and the roads harassed instead of risking open battles. The Crusaders went on to capture Antioch, Edessa, and finally Jerusalem, founding new Christian principalities in the east. Godfrey of Bouillon became ruler of Jerusalem. Raymond established himself in Edessa, and Bohemund took control of Antioch. Meanwhile, Kılıç Arslan relocated his capital to Iconium, modern Konya, strengthening his position in central Anatolia. When Pope Urban II died in 1099, his successor Paschal II continued to urge Christian armies eastward. In 1101, 3 more Crusader forces set out through Asia Minor: Lombards, French knights, and a massive Franco-German host. But all were annihilated by the Seljuks and their Danişmendid allies. The so-called Crusade of 1101 ended in disaster, restoring Turkish dominance over the Anatolian plateau. Emperor Alexius spent his final years campaigning in Western Asia Minor, achieving one last victory against the Seljuk Sultan Mesut I in 1115. He died on August 15, 1118, after a remarkable 37-year reign that had revived the Byzantine state from near ruin. His son John II succeeded him, beginning his rule with campaigns that expelled the Turks from Ionia, Lydia, and Pamphylia. John defeated the Patzinaks in 1122, then waged war against Venice and Hungary before turning east again to reclaim the Black Sea coast from the Turks. Between 1130 and 1141, he led yearly campaigns in Asia Minor, recovering lost fortresses and re-establishing imperial control from Paphlagonia to Trebizond. In 1142, John began preparations for an expedition to retake Antioch from the Latin Crusaders. He spent the winter in Cilicia, capturing several Donismendid strongholds, but before the next spring campaign could begin, he was accidentally wounded by an arrow while hunting. The wound became infected, and he died on April 8, 1143. Chronicler Nicetas Choniates later wrote that John was the crowning glory of the Comnenian dynasty, equal to the finest emperors of old and superior to most. John was succeeded by his energetic son, Manuel I, who was crowned in Hagia Sophia that November. His first campaign, in 1144, forced the Latin princes of Antioch to return fortresses they had seized in Cilicia. But soon after, the Seljuks captured Edessa, massacring its Christian population, an event that shocked Europe and inspired Pope Eugenius III to call for a new crusade. The Second Crusade began in 1146, led by King Conrad III of Germany and King Louis VII of France, both of whom passed through Constantinople. Conrad's army was destroyed by the Seljuks near Dorylaeum, and Louis's forces, after crossing Anatolia, sailed to Antioch. From there, the Crusaders marched on Damascus in July 1148, but after only 4 days of heavy fighting, they were forced to retreat under constant attack from Muslim cavalry. The campaign collapsed in humiliation, and the Crusaders withdrew in disarray. Thus, the Second Crusade ended in total failure, and the Seljuks retained control of Edessa, while the Byzantine Empire under Manuel I continued to stand as the dominant power of the Christian East. In his later years, Emperor Manuel I Komnenos found himself fighting on multiple fronts, against the Seljuks in Anatolia and against the Serbs, Hungarians, Normans, and Venetians in Europe. His conflict with Venice erupted dramatically on March 12, 1171, when he expelled all Venetian merchants from Constantinople. For nearly a century, they had occupied a wealthy trading quarter along the Golden Horn beside the Genoese and Pisans, and this expulsion ignited their fury. The Venetians retaliated with naval attacks on Byzantine ports throughout the Aegean and forged alliances with both the Normans and Germans against Byzantium. Though an uneasy truce eventually followed, relations between the two powers collapsed completely. This growing hostility between the Latin West and the Greek East widened the cultural and spiritual gulf separating them. As the Byzantine historian Nicetas Choniates bitterly observed, "The accursed Latins lust after our possessions and would destroy our race. Between us lies a great gulf of hatred. Our paths run in opposite directions." Despite this tension, Manuel sought one final diplomatic gesture of unity. He arranged for the betrothal of his young son, Alexius, to Princess Agnes of France, daughter of King Louis VII. The child bride, only 8 years old, arrived in Constantinople and took the name Anna upon her marriage to the 12-year-old Alexius in the Grand Basilica of Hagia Sophia on March 2, 1180. But Manuel himself was gravely ill. Having retired to the monastery of the Pantocrator, he died a few months later, on September 24, 1180, ending one of Byzantium's most ambitious and outward-looking reigns. His teenage son, Alexius II, succeeded him, with his mother, Maria of Antioch, acting as regent. Maria favored the Latin faction at court, granting key posts to Westerners, which enraged both the Byzantine nobility and common citizens. They derisively called her Xena, the foreigner, and soon rallied behind Andronicus Komnenos, a charismatic but ruthless nephew of Emperor John II. Living in exile in Paphlagonia, Andronicus seized the moment, gathered his supporters, and marched on Constantinople in 1182. His troops crossed the Bosphorus and joined the city's mobs in a horrific massacre of the Latins. When he entered the capital, Andronicus took full control, accused the empress of treason, and had her drowned in secret. Proclaiming himself regent for the young Alexius II, Andronicus was crowned co-emperor later that year. Before long, he had the boy strangled, then married his child widow, Anna, who was barely 11. The act shocked both Byzantium and Western Europe, but it was only the beginning of his tyranny. Andronicus launched a reign of terror, executing nobles and officials he suspected of plotting against him. Meanwhile, the empire's borders came under simultaneous attack from the Seljuks, Hungarians, and Normans. In 1185, the Normans invaded Greece and captured Thessalonica, advancing rapidly toward Constantinople. Panic gripped the capital, and the people turned on Andronicus for failing to defend them. Amid the chaos, a distant relative of the imperial family, Isaac Angelos, rose in revolt. He escaped arrest, took refuge in Hagia Sophia, and called upon the citizens to rise with him. The people answered his plea, stormed the palace, and on September 12, 1185, Isaac was proclaimed emperor as Isaac II. Andronicus was captured while fleeing the city and subjected to a gruesome public execution, paraded backward on a camel through the streets, mutilated and torn to pieces by the mob. His death marked the violent end of the Komnenian dynasty, which had ruled gloriously for more than a century. Isaac II inherited a shaken empire, but quickly defeated the invading Normans, pushing them back to Italy and Sicily. Yet internal weakness persisted. In the following decade, Isaac faced the approach of the Third Crusade. The German army of Frederick Barbarossa passed peacefully through Byzantine lands on its way to the Holy Land, while other Crusader forces sailed along the coast of Anatolia. Barbarossa himself drowned in the Kalakadnis River in 1190 before reaching his destination. At home, Isaac struggled to maintain control. He fought the Seljuks in Anatolia and faced rebellions from the Bulgars, Serbs, Cumans, and Vlachs in the Balkans. The Vlachs and Bulgars defeated imperial armies twice, in 1190 and 1194, forcing Isaac to take the field himself. But during his 1195 campaign, his elder brother, Alexius, staged a coup, had him seized, blinded, and imprisoned in the Blachernae Palace alongside his son, Alexius. The usurper then crowned himself Emperor Alexius III. During his reign, Alexius III waged several military campaigns against the Seljuks and the Vlachs, but his corruption and mismanagement weakened the empire even further. In 1201, while accompanying his young nephew Alexius on campaign, the boy escaped and fled west to his sister Irene and her husband, Philip of Swabia, brother of the German Emperor Henry VI. From there, young Alexius began appealing to Western Europe to help restore his blinded father, Isaac II, to the Byzantine throne. By this time, Pope Innocent III had ascended to the papacy, and in 1198 issued a call for a new crusade, the Fourth Crusade. The movement gained momentum in 1199 as French nobles, including Count Baldwin of Flanders, took up the cross. To transport their armies, they struck a deal with Venice. The aging Doge Enrico Dandolo promised ships and 50 war galleys in exchange for a full share of any spoils. The Crusaders agreed, and at a council in Soissons, they chose Boniface of Montferrat as their leader, setting the stage for one of the most fateful and controversial chapters in Byzantine history. When the Crusaders finally gathered in Italy, they were far fewer than expected. Barely 11,000 soldiers instead of the 30,000 they had planned for. Unable to pay the Venetians the enormous sum agreed for transport, the expedition seemed doomed before it began. But the shrewd Doge Enrico Dandolo offered a solution. Venice would postpone payment if the Crusaders helped recapture the Dalmatian city of Zara, which had recently defected to the Hungarian crown. The Crusaders agreed, and on September 8, 1202, the Great Fleet sailed from Venice. 2 months later, on November 10th, they reached Zara, besieged it for 2 weeks, and forced its surrender. Though the inhabitants were spared, the city was thoroughly looted. Winter made further travel impossible, so the army remained there until spring. It was during this pause that destiny took a darker turn. Envoys arrived from the young Byzantine prince Alexius Angelus, son of the deposed Emperor Isaac II. He offered the Crusaders a tempting deal. If they restored his father to the throne, he would pay them vast sums of gold, cover their expenses for a year, and even pledge to reunite the Eastern and Western churches under the Pope. The desperate Crusaders and Doge Dandolo accepted the offer. Instead of sailing to the Holy Land, the crusade was redirected toward Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world. On June 24, 1203, the Latin fleet reached the Bosphorus and forced its way into the Golden Horn. After fierce fighting along the sea walls, the Crusaders stormed into Constantinople on July 17th, setting much of the Fifth Hill ablaze. That night, Emperor Alexius III fled the city with the imperial treasury, while his blinded brother Isaac II was freed from his tower and restored to the throne. His son, Alexius IV, was crowned co-emperor in Hagia Sophia on August 1st. The Crusaders, believing their mission fulfilled, encamped outside the walls by the Blachernae Palace. The Seljuk throne passed to Khusrev's son, Izzeddin Kekavus, who soon made peace with Nicaea and focused on strengthening the Sultanate of Rum. He signed trade agreements with the Lusignan king of Cyprus and developed 2 key ports, Antalya on the Mediterranean and Sinop on the Black Sea, transforming the Seljuks into a major maritime power. By this time, Theodore Lascaris had consolidated control over western Anatolia. His capital at Nicaea became a refuge for Byzantine culture and administration. Yet he remained in constant conflict with his Latin rivals, who still held much of the Aegean coastline, and with the Comneni of Trebizond. The rivalry ended when Theodore captured Heraclea Pontica, forcing David Comnenus to flee. The Seljuks later took Sinop, killing David and capturing Alexius Comnenus, who was forced to surrender his city and accept vassalage to the Sultan. From then on, Trebizond became little more than a regional state, overshadowed by Nicaea and the rising Turkish powers. Under Kekavus and his brother Alaeddin Kekubad, the Seljuks expanded their influence across Anatolia. When Kekavus died in 1220, Alaeddin became Sultan and immediately began building his legacy. Meanwhile, Theodore Lascaris died in 1221, leaving his throne to his capable son-in-law, John III Vatatzes. John moved his capital from Nicaea to Nymphium, closer to Smyrna, to better guard his frontiers against both the Latins and the Seljuks. At the same time, Sultan Alaeddin Kekubad embarked on a massive campaign of fortification and naval expansion. He captured Kaloneros, a stronghold on the Pamphylian coast, and transformed it into the city of Alanya. naming it after himself. There, he built towering fortresses, harbors, and shipyards that still stand today. With Alanya on the Mediterranean and Sinop on the Black Sea, Kekubad proudly called himself Sultan of the Two Seas, signaling the rise of Turkish maritime power and the dawn of a new political order in Anatolia, an order in which the old Byzantine world would never fully recover. When Sultan Alaaeddin Kekubad died in May 1237, his son Ghiyaseddin Khusrev II inherited a realm soon to be crushed beneath the advancing Mongol storm. The Mongols had already devastated Russia, Poland, and the Balkans, leaving behind a trail of slaughter so vast that a chronicler of the age lamented, "No eye remained open to weep for the dead." From the Great Plains of Central Asia, their armies swept into Azerbaijan, setting the stage for a catastrophic invasion of Anatolia. In 1239, the Mongol general Chormagan sacked the ancient Armenian cities of Kars and Ani, killing their entire populations. By the winter of 1242, another Mongol force under Baiju advanced into eastern Anatolia, capturing Erzurum and opening the road into the heart of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. In response, Khusrev II rallied every ally he could find, Christian and Muslim alike, assembling an army of some 80,000 men at Sivas, with the Nicaean Emperor John Vatatzes contributing a Greek and Latin contingent. The Seljuk forces, led by the Georgian prince Shirvashidze, met Baiju's smaller but more disciplined army at the mountain pass of Kosada on June 26, 1243. The Mongols crushed the Seljuk vanguard, killed Shirvashidze, and routed the rest of the army. The Sultan fled in panic, leaving behind his treasures and even his royal tent. Baiju's victorious troops advanced through Anatolia, plundering Sivas, Tokat, and Kayseri, the last two suffering horrific massacres. Defeated and desperate, Khusrev escaped to Ankara and then Konya, while his vizier Muhaddab al-Din negotiated peace with the Mongol commander Jurmagan. The terms were humiliating. The Seljuks became Mongol vassals, bound to pay annual tribute in gold and silver. The once mighty Sultanate of Rum was now reduced to a client state, its power broken and its heartlands in chaos. This Mongol domination unexpectedly benefited Emperor John III Vatatzes of Nicaea, whose eastern frontier was now secure. He consolidated his empire and married Constance, the young daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, strengthening his western ties. Under Vatatzes, Nicaea prospered and flourished culturally, with the court poet Nicholas Irenikos composing grand verses to celebrate the imperial marriage. Khusrev died in early 1246, leaving three underage sons who were elevated as joint rulers: Izzeddin Kekavus II, Ruknuddin Kulich Arslan IV, and Alaaeddin Kekubad II. Their guardians fought bitterly for control until Emir Celaleddin Karatai, advisor to Izzeddin, seized power as regent in 1249 and reorganized the Sultanate under his authority. Meanwhile, in Nicaea, Emperor John Vatatzes died in 1254 and was later canonized as John the Merciful, remembered for restoring stability and fostering learning across the Byzantine exile state. His son, Theodore II Lascaris, succeeded him at age 33. A scholar and philosopher educated by the renowned Nicephorus Blemides and George Acropolites, Theodore's reign saw a brilliant revival of learning. Yet his rule was troubled by suspicion and intrigue, especially toward the ambitious general Michael Palaiologus, whom Theodore accused of plotting to seize the throne. Michael fled to Konya, where Sultan Izzeddin Kikavus welcomed him and granted him command of a Christian division in his army. That same year, the Mongol commander Baiju launched another invasion of Anatolia. The Seljuk army, reinforced by Michael's troops, met the Mongols south of Aksaray, but was swiftly defeated. Terrified soldiers deserted, and the Seljuk vizier was killed. Michael narrowly escaped with his life and fled back to Nicaea. This disastrous defeat marked the true end of Seljuk independence. As one Turkish historian later wrote, thorns replaced the rose in the gardens of justice and prosperity. Shortly after, Theodore II Lascaris died in 1258, leaving his young son John IV as heir. Before his death, Theodore appointed his loyal minister George Mouzalon as regent, but within days the powerful nobles murdered Mouzalon and elevated Michael Palaeologus to power. By December, Michael had been proclaimed co-emperor, and in 1259 he was crowned alongside the boy emperor in a ceremony where it was clear that he, not John, would rule the empire. Michael VIII Palaeologus quickly proved his ambition. His brother John defeated the Latins at Pelagonia, while his general Alexius Strategopulus conquered much of Epirus. In 1260, Michael attempted to seize Constantinople but failed, settling instead for a one-year truce. The next year he signed a crucial alliance with the Genoese at Nymphaeum, granting them commercial privileges and control of Smyrna in exchange for naval support against the Venetians, who defended the Latin Empire. Then, in the summer of 1261, fate intervened. While Michael was campaigning in Greece, his general Strategopulus discovered that Constantinople was undefended. The Venetian fleet and most of the Latin garrison were away raiding the Black Sea. Acting swiftly, his men entered the city through a hidden passage near the Gate of the Page and opened the gates for the Byzantine troops. On July 25, 1261, Constantinople was retaken. Emperor Baldwin II fled in panic aboard a Venetian ship, and the city that had fallen to the Crusaders 60 years earlier was once again in Byzantine hands. The dream of restoration was complete. The empire of the Romans had returned from exile. Strategopulus, buoyed by the city's Greeks, torched the Latin quarter along the Golden Horn. When the Venetian fleet returned from raiding in the Black Sea, sailors found their families huddled on the shoreline like smoked-out bees. They could only embark their people and sail away, ending the Latin occupation of Constantinople. Michael VIII Palaeologos, still in Greece when the news reached him, broke camp and hurried to the capital. He entered the city on the 15th of August, the feast of the Assumption, and processed to Hagia Sophia, where he personally seated Patriarch Arsenius on the throne. A Thanksgiving service marked the empire's return to its ancient seat after 57 years in exile. Michael was crowned again with his wife Theodora as empress, and their toddler son Andronikos was made co-emperor and heir. The legitimate boy emperor, John IV Lascaris, was left behind in Nicaea. Within months, Michael had him blinded and shut away at Dacabais on the Gulf of Nicomedia, and he vanished from the record. Reconstruction began at once. The city, ruined and depopulated by the Latin era, had to be rebuilt and repopulated, an effort that nearly bankrupted the shrunken state. To save costs, Michael pared back the army and navy and outsourced sea trade to Genoa, granting the Genoese Galata across the Golden Horn as an autonomous colony run by a podesta. Despite a ban on fortifying it, they raised stout walls down to the water and crowned the hill with the Galata Tower. Michael died campaigning in Thrace in December 1282 and was followed by his son Andronikos II. The new emperor associated his own son as Michael IX in 1294. Michael IX's marriage to the Armenian princess Rita, who took the name Maria, produced Andronikos III, the man who would replace his grandfather in 1328. By then, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum was only a memory. Ghiyaseddin Mesud II, son of Izzeddin Kikavus II, was murdered at Kayseri in 1305, effectively closing the Seljuk line. Mongol domination weighed mainly on central and eastern Anatolia. In the west, Byzantium now faced a ring of rising Turkmen beyliks. The smallest of these, the Osmanlı, followers of Osman Gazi, would prove decisive. Pakimirs, writing under Andronikos II, first notes Osman during a 1302 campaign. A Byzantine force of about 2,000 under Muzalon was driven off by 5,000 Turkish Ghazis under Atman. Osman. Victory drew more warriors to Osman from the Meander Valley and Paphlagonia. He beat Muzalon at Bephius near Nicomedia, 1302, seized Bilecik and nearby strongholds, and turned Bithynia's open country into a killing ground. Fortified cities, Nicaea, Prusa, Pegi, held out, but their hinterlands starved and bled. Turkish bands also crossed into Europe. Some hired out to the Serbian king. Others, led by a chieftain named Halil, shredded Thrace until Andronikos, with Serbian and Genoese help, trapped and destroyed them on the Gallipoli Peninsula in 1312. Osman died in 1324, leaving power to his son Orhan, the first of his line to assume the title of Sultan. Orhan took Prusa, Bursa, in 1326 as his capital and pressed the long siege of Nicaea. Andronikos III, newly on the throne, tried to relieve the city in 1329 with John Cantacuzenos and 4,000 to 5,000 veterans, but Orhan defeated them at Pelikanon and wounded the emperor. Nicaea, Iznik, fell on the 1st of March, 1331. Nicomedia, Izmit, succumbed after famine in 1337. By then, Orhan had absorbed the neighboring Karasu Beylik and controlled virtually all of westernmost Anatolia, east of the Bosphorus, the Marmara, and the Dardanelles. Andronikos III died in 1341, leaving a 9-year-old heir, John V, with John Cantacuzenos as regent. Civil war followed until 1347, when Cantacuzenos was crowned John VI, senior co-emperor. The Black Death had already ravaged Constantinople, killing a third of its people. Seeking stability, John VI allied with Orhan in 1346, marrying his daughter Theodora to the Ottoman Sultan at Selimbria. Orhan repeatedly sent his son Suleiman with troops to aid his ally in Thrace. In 1352, Suleiman seized the fortress of Zemp. An earthquake on 2nd March 1354 then shattered the walls of Gallipoli and nearby towns, which their Greek inhabitants abandoned. Suleiman moved in, rebuilt the defenses, and refused to leave, arguing he had occupied ruins, not conquered cities. From Gallipoli, the Ottomans poured into Thrace, raiding towns and countryside and establishing their first permanent foothold in Europe. The balance of power around the Bosphorus had shifted for good. During the mid-14th century, the Ottoman frontier pushed outward on both sides of the Aegean. In 1354, Suleiman, son of Orhan, seized Ankara from the Eretnid Beylik, bringing into Ottoman hands a city that would centuries later become Turkey's capital. He also captured the Thracian towns of Malkara, Ipsala, and Vaisa before dying in 1357 after a fall from his horse. Orhan Gazi died in 1362, and his son Murad I, already active in Thrace, became Sultan. Soon afterward, he He captured Adrianople, Edirne, turning it into the new Ottoman capital. From Edirne, Murad launched 2 decades of expansion, his armies sweeping into Greece, Macedonia, Serbia, Bosnia, and Bulgaria, while also absorbing Anatolian beyliks such as Jermian, Hamid, and Teke, including the port of Antalya. Meanwhile, Emperor John V Palaeologus journeyed to Rome in 1367 to meet Pope Urban V, agreeing to a church union under papal authority in exchange for Western aid. Though proclaimed a Catholic, he found himself a debtor in Venice and returned home only in 1371. A year later, under Ottoman pressure, he accepted Murad's overlordship and even joined the Sultan's campaigns in Anatolia, prompting papal outrage over this impious alliance. His absence allowed his son Andronikos IV to revolt in 1374, one of several Byzantine civil wars that would continue until John's death in 1391, when Manuel II, his surviving son, finally secured the throne. By then, Murad had tightened his grip on the Balkans, taking Thessalonica in 1387 after a long siege and extending Ottoman control over southern Macedonia. His capture of Niš in 1385 provoked Prince Lazar of Serbia to form a Christian coalition with Bosnia and others. The decisive clash came on the 15th of June, 1389 at Kosovo Polje, where the Ottomans triumphed after a brutal battle. Murad was assassinated by a Serbian nobleman feigning surrender, while Lazar was captured and executed by Murad's son, Bayezid. With Serbia crushed and reduced to vassalage, Ottoman rule in the Balkans was firmly established. Bayezid, nicknamed Yildirim, or Lightning for his speed, seized the throne after killing his brother Jakub, marking the first act of fratricide in Ottoman history. He expanded on both fronts, deep into Anatolia and Europe, and formalized the Janissary Corps, an elite infantry force drawn from the Dev Shurme, the periodic levy of Christian youths converted to Islam and trained for total loyalty to the Sultan. Prohibited from marriage and private life, they became the most disciplined and effective soldiers in the empire. In 1389, Bayezid subdued the Saruhan and Aden Emirates, capturing Smyrna and gaining an Aegean port of immense strategic value. The city's history was turbulent, once given to the Genoese by Michael VIII Palaeologus, besieged by Umur Bey of Aden in the 1320s, retaken in a papal crusade of 1344, and held by the Knights of St. John until Bayezid's conquest in 1389. Soon after, Bayezid besieged Constantinople, building the fortress of Anadolu Hisar to block Black Sea access. While tightening his grip on the Bosphorus, he marched north, capturing Nicopolis on the Danube in 1395. In response, King Sigismund of Hungary organized a vast crusade. Nearly 100,000 troops from across Europe and the fleets from Genoa, Venice, and the Knights of St. John. At Nicopolis on the 25th of September, 1396, Bayezid crushed the Crusaders and executed most of the captives, though Sigismund escaped. The victory confirmed the Ottomans as the dominant power in southeastern Europe, poised to challenge the last remnants of Byzantium. After the crushing defeat at Nicopolis, Sultan Bayezid renewed his siege of Constantinople. The Byzantine emperor, now reinforced by 1,200 French soldiers under Marshal Boucicaut, soon realized that such a small force could not save the city. At Boucicaut's urging, Emperor Manuel II traveled to France to plead for aid from King Charles VI, and later went on to England, where King Henry IV received him in London with full honors as a great Christian prince from the East. Yet, despite promises of help, no Western army came, and Manuel returned to Constantinople in early 1403 empty-handed. By that time, the balance of power had shifted dramatically. The previous spring, Bayezid had lifted the siege and hurried eastward to confront a Mongol invasion led by the formidable conqueror Tamerlane. On the 28th of July, 1402, near Ankara, the two armies clashed. The Mongols routed the Ottomans, whose ranks collapsed in panic, many soldiers deserting before the fight was done. Bayezid was captured and soon died in captivity, according to legend confined in an iron cage by Tamerlane. His defeat marked one of the darkest hours of Ottoman history. Tamerlane ravaged Anatolia, sacking Bursa, Konya, Tyre, Ephesus, Smyrna, and Phocaea, leaving behind towers built from human skulls to terrify survivors. The Ottoman state, once powerful, was shattered. Anatolian beyliks regained independence, and Christian vassals in the Balkans broke free. For 11 chaotic years, Bayezid's surviving sons, Suleiman, Musa, Isa, Mustafa, and Mehmet, fought a brutal civil war for control of the empire. This internal conflict, known as the Ottoman Interregnum, ended in 1413 when Mehmet, the youngest, defeated and killed his brother Musa in Bulgaria. As Sultan Mehmet I, he spent the next 8 years rebuilding the broken empire, restoring Ottoman authority in both Anatolia and the Balkans. He recaptured Smyrna from the Aydınid emir Cüneyt Bey and campaigned across the Danube into Wallachia before dying in 1421 after a fall from his horse. His son, the 17-year-old Murad II, succeeded him, a young but battle-hardened warrior already tested in his father's wars. Murad's early reign was immediately troubled by two rivals, the pretender Düzme Mustafa and his own younger brother Mustafa, both supported by the Byzantine Emperor Manuel II. Murad crushed them both, securing his throne, and in retaliation besieged Constantinople in June 1422. Yet the city's formidable defenses held firm, and by the end of summer, he withdrew. Emperor Manuel suffered a fatal stroke soon after, and upon his death in 1425, his son John VIII Palaeologus became emperor. Murad then turned to reclaim lost lands. In 1423, he subdued the Isfendiarid emir on the Black Sea, forcing him to become an Ottoman vassal again, and then marched west to subdue Vlad II Dracul of Wallachia, who likewise accepted Ottoman suzerainty. He next besieged Thessalonica, which had been ceded by the Byzantines to the Venetians in desperation. The Venetians allied with Cüneyt Bey of Aden, but Murad's commander Hamza defeated and killed Cüneyt in 1425, ending the Aydınid Beylik and restoring Smyrna to Ottoman rule. By 1430, after years of campaigns across Anatolia and the Black Sea, Murad retook Thessalonica, enslaving thousands of its inhabitants. As Emperor John VIII sought Western support, the Council of Ferrara-Florence convened in 1439, uniting the Greek and Latin churches under Pope Eugenius IV. However, the union deeply divided Byzantium, as many saw it as betrayal. Meanwhile, Murad's armies swept across Greece, Albania, and Serbia, capturing Ioannina and advancing toward Hungary. In 1440, he besieged Belgrade, recognizing it as the gateway to Hungary, but suffered heavy losses and withdrew. John Hunyadi, the heroic governor of Transylvania, soon emerged as Murad's most dangerous foe, defeating Ottoman forces in 1442 and inspiring Pope Eugenius IV to call for another crusade. European rulers rallied to the cause, while Murad suppressed a revolt in Anatolia by Ibrahim Bey of Karaman. Despite his military burdens, Murad still found time to leave his mark on architecture, building the great Muradiye mosque complexes in Bursa and later Edirne, along with his royal palace on an island in the Tunka River. In 1443, a massive crusader army led by Hunyadi and King Ladislas of Hungary invaded Ottoman lands. Murad fought them in bitter winter battles between Sofia and Niš, both sides suffering terrible losses. Eventually, a 10-year peace treaty was signed at Edirne in June 1444, giving Murad time to restore order in Anatolia. He left his 12-year-old son Mehmet as regent under Grand Vizier Chandarlı Halil Pasha and marched east to suppress Ibrahim Bey's rebellion. When the campaign ended in victory, Murad returned to Bursa, visited the tomb of his deceased son Alaeddin, and then, in a stunning gesture, renounced the throne. Around September 1444, Murad II proclaimed his abdication, declaring to his court, "I have given all I possess, my crown and my throne, to my son. From this day forward, you will serve him as your sultan." Thus, the young Mehmet II, destined to become Mehmet the Conqueror, ascended the Ottoman throne, while his father, weary of endless war, briefly withdrew from the stage of history. When Sultan Murad II announced his abdication, his ministers were alarmed. Grand Vizier Halil Pasha, who had witnessed young Mehmet's inexperience during his earlier regency, tried to dissuade him. Yet Murad was resolute. Accompanied by Ishak Pasha and Hamza Bey, he retired to Manisa to live in seclusion, devoting himself to study and prayer while leaving the state in Mehmet's hands. However, the young sultan's inexperience soon became apparent. The empire grew restless, and Murad was persuaded to return to the throne in September 1446, while Mehmet was sent back to govern Manisa as a provincial ruler. Meanwhile, John Hunyadi, the brilliant Hungarian commander, gathered a new army to unite with the Albanian hero Skanderbeg against the Ottomans. Murad intercepted him on the same field where his father had triumphed decades earlier, the plains of Kosovo. From 17 to 20 October 1448, the Second Battle of Kosovo ended in another crushing Ottoman victory, leaving Christian hopes in ruins once again. In the Byzantine world, Emperor John VIII Palaeologus died on 31 October 1448, leaving behind a fragile empire and three brothers, Constantine, Demetrius, and Thomas, and their mother, Helena Dragas. As soon as news reached Constantinople, Demetrius raced to claim the throne. But Helena intervened, determined that her eldest surviving son, Constantine, should succeed. She assumed regency and dispatched a messenger to Mistra, the capital of the despotate of the Morea, where Constantine ruled. On receiving the message, Constantine was proclaimed emperor and crowned as Constantine XI on the 6th of January 1449 in the Church of St. Demetrius at Mistra. Murad then turned to reclaim lost lands. In 1423, he subdued the Isfendiarid emir on the Black Sea, forcing him to become an Ottoman vassal again, and then marched west to subdue Vlad II Dracul of Wallachia, who likewise accepted Ottoman suzerainty. He next besieged Thessalonica, which had been ceded by the Byzantines to the Venetians in desperation. The Venetians allied with Cuneit Bey of Aden, but Murad's commander Hamza defeated and killed Cuneit in 1425, ending the Aydınid Beylik and restoring Smyrna to Ottoman rule. By 1430, after years of campaigns across Anatolia and the Black Sea, Murad retook Thessalonica, enslaving thousands of its inhabitants. As Emperor John VIII sought Western support, the Council of Ferrara-Florence convened in 1439, uniting the Greek and Latin churches under Pope Eugenius IV. However, the union deeply divided Byzantium, as many saw it as betrayal. Meanwhile, Murad's armies swept across Greece, Albania, and Serbia, capturing Ioannina and advancing toward Hungary. In 1440, he besieged Belgrade, recognizing it as the gateway to Hungary, but suffered heavy losses and withdrew. John Hunyadi, the heroic governor of Transylvania, soon emerged as Murad's most dangerous foe, defeating Ottoman forces in 1442 and inspiring Pope Eugenius IV to call for another crusade. European rulers rallied to the cause, while Murad suppressed a revolt in Anatolia by Ibrahim Bey of Karaman. Despite his military burdens, Murad still found time to leave his mark on architecture, building the great Muradiye mosque complexes in Bursa and later Edirne, along with his royal palace on an island in the Tunka River. In 1443, a massive crusader army led by Hunyadi and King Ladislas of Hungary invaded Ottoman lands. Murad fought them in bitter winter battles between Sofia and Niš, both sides suffering terrible losses. Eventually, a 10-year peace treaty was signed at Edirne in June 1444, giving Murad time to restore order in Anatolia. He left his 12-year-old son Mehmet as regent under Grand Vizier Chandarlı Halil Pasha and marched east to suppress Ibrahim Bey's rebellion. When the campaign ended in victory, Murad returned to Bursa, visited the tomb of his deceased son Alauddin, and then, in a stunning gesture, renounced the throne. Around September 1444, Murad II proclaimed his abdication, declaring to his court, "I have given all I possess, my crown and my throne, to my son. From this day forward, you will serve him as your sultan." Thus, the young Mehmet II, destined to become Mehmet the Conqueror, ascended the Ottoman throne, while his father, weary of endless war, briefly withdrew from the stage of history. When Sultan Murad II announced his abdication, his ministers were alarmed. Grand Vizier Halil Pasha, who had witnessed young Mehmet's inexperience during his earlier regency, tried to dissuade him. Yet Murad was resolute. Accompanied by Ishak Pasha and Hamza Bey, he retired to Manisa to live in seclusion, devoting himself to study and prayer while leaving the state in Mehmet's hands. However, the young sultan's inexperience soon became apparent. The empire grew restless, and Murad was persuaded to return to the throne in September 1446, while Mehmet was sent back to govern Manisa as a provincial ruler. Meanwhile, John Hunyadi, the brilliant Hungarian commander, gathered a new army to unite with the Albanian hero Skanderbeg against the Ottomans. Murad intercepted him on the same field where his father had triumphed decades earlier, the plains of Kosovo. From 17 to 20 October 1448, the Second Battle of Kosovo ended in another crushing Ottoman victory, leaving Christian hopes in ruins once again. In the Byzantine world, Emperor John VIII Palaeologus died on 31 October 1448, leaving behind a fragile empire and three brothers, Constantine, Demetrius, and Thomas, and their mother, Helena Dragas. As soon as news reached Constantinople, Demetrius raced to claim the throne. But Helena intervened, determined that her eldest surviving son, Constantine, should succeed. She assumed regency and dispatched a messenger to Mistra, the capital of the despotate of the Morea, where Constantine ruled. On receiving the message, Constantine was proclaimed emperor and crowned as Constantine XI on the 6th of January 1449 in the Church of St. Demetrius at Mistra. Constantine was 44 years old, twice married but childless. Though attempts were made to find him a new bride for a dynastic alliance, none succeeded. After his coronation, he divided the rule of the Morea between his brothers, Demetrius in Mistra and Thomas in Achaia, and traveled to Constantinople, arriving on the 12th of March, 1449. His first act as emperor was to send greetings to Murad II and seek a renewal of peace between their realms. But Constantine inherited a deeply divided empire. The city was torn over the controversial union of the Greek and Roman churches signed by his brother John VIII at the Council of Florence. Most of the clergy and citizens opposed it bitterly, seeing it as submission to the Latins. Yet Constantine believed the union was the only hope for Western aid against the advancing Ottomans. Among his strongest opponents was the scholar-monk George Scholarios, who withdrew from public life in 1450, retiring to the monastery of the Pantocrator. Murad II died at Edirne on the 3rd of February, 1451. Grand Vizier Halil Pasha kept his death secret until Murad's son could arrive from Manisa. On the 17th of February, the 19-year-old Mehmet reached Edirne, and the next day the army acclaimed him as Sultan Mehmet II. Though still young, he had matured since his first brief reign and was now driven by boundless ambition. Critobulus of Imbros, Mehmet's contemporary biographer, describes the young ruler as a man whose vision extended far beyond his inheritance. He writes that Mehmet, master of vast lands across Asia and Europe, was not content with what he possessed, but sought to rival Alexander the Great, Pompey, Caesar, and all the great conquerors of history. He dreamed of ruling the world. Soon after his accession, Mehmet opened diplomatic contact with neighboring rulers, Christian and Muslim alike, including John IV of Trebizond. The Byzantine ambassador George Sphrantzes, serving Emperor Constantine XI, met John IV and warned him of the danger ahead. The new Sultan, Sphrantzes cautioned, is young and filled with hostility towards the Christians. He speaks with proud defiance and declares that he will soon act upon his plans against our faith. Should God permit his ambition to prevail, I fear for what will come upon our city. As soon as Mehmet II took the throne, he reappointed Halil Pasha as Grand Vizier, despite deeply distrusting him. Mehmet still resented Halil for obstructing his first attempt to rule and suspected him of secretly taking bribes from the Byzantines. Yet the young sultan kept him in office for the time being, biding his time until he could remove him. Determined to fulfill the dream of conquering Constantinople, Mehmet began preparing for war. In 1452, he ordered the construction of a massive fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus, directly across from the older fortress of Anadolu Hisar. The new fortress, called Rumeli Hisar, was completed in just 3 months. Together, these strongholds allowed Mehmet to cut off Constantinople from its crucial grain supply from the Black Sea. The final siege began before sunrise on April 5th, 1453. Mehmet's vast army, around 80,000 men, encircled the city, stretching from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn. Inside the walls, Emperor Constantine XI and his outnumbered defenders, barely 7,000 strong, including Venetian and Genoese allies under Giovanni Giustiniani, prepared for a desperate fight. For more than 7 weeks, the defenders resisted wave after wave of Ottoman assaults. Mehmet's massive artillery, including a gigantic cannon built by the Hungarian engineer Urban, relentlessly bombarded the ancient Theodosian walls. The city shook under the thunder of cannon fire, while its weary defenders worked through the nights repairing breaches with stones, wood, and even household furniture. On May 28th, the eve of the final attack, Mehmet ordered his men to take their positions. Within the city, priests and citizens marched in solemn procession carrying icons and relics, praying for deliverance. That night, thousands gathered in Hagia Sophia, seeking hope and forgiveness. Emperor Constantine prayed among them, then returned to the Blachernay Palace to bid farewell to his officers and friends, asking their forgiveness before taking his place on the front lines. In the early hours of May 29th, the Ottoman attack began. The first assault came from the irregular soldiers known as the Bashi Bazouks, who rushed forward shouting battle cries beneath the roar of drums and horns. The defenders held their ground, forcing the attackers to retreat after 2 hours of brutal combat. Then came the second wave, regular infantry from Anatolia, advancing under Ishak and Mahmud Pasha, their charge covered by heavy artillery fire. Just before dawn, a massive cannonball shattered part of the wall near the gate of St. Romanus, and Ottoman troops surged through the breach, only to be cut down by Constantine and his men. Finally, Mehmet sent in his elite janissaries, leading them personally to the Moat. At sunrise, around 300 janissaries forced their way through the broken walls. In the chaos, Justiniani was gravely wounded and carried from the battlefield, despite the emperor's pleas to stay. His departure shattered morale among the defenders. Surrounded and overwhelmed, Constantine made his last stand near the gate of St. Romanus, fighting alongside his companions until he fell, his body lost among the dead. By mid-morning, the Ottoman banners rose over the towers of the Theodosian walls and the palace of Blachernay. Resistance crumbled, and the city was overrun. As promised, Mehmet allowed his soldiers to plunder Constantinople for 3 days. The streets filled with screams as churches and palaces were looted, sacred relics seized, and thousands of Greeks slain or enslaved. Nearly 50,000 people, virtually the city's entire population, were taken captive. When Mehmet finally entered the ruined city that afternoon, passing through the Adrianople Gate, he paused in silence. Witnessing the devastation, he was said to have wept, lamenting the destruction of so magnificent a city. "What a city we have delivered to ruin and plunder," he said with sorrow. That same day, 29th of May, 1453, Sultan Mehmet II made his triumphant entry into Constantinople. As his soldiers cheered and hailed him as Fatih, the conqueror, he rode toward Hagia Sophia, symbol of his victory. From that moment, the 1,000-year-old Byzantine Empire was no more, and the great city of Constantinople, known to the Turks as Constantiniye, became Istanbul, the city. The world had entered a new age. After the fall of Constantinople, Sultan Mehmet II rode through the ancient heart of the city along the Roman road known as the Mese, passing through the ruins of the old Byzantine capital until he reached the great church of Hagia Sophia. Before entering, he dismounted, knelt on the ground, and humbly poured a handful of earth over his turban, acknowledging the sacred weight of the moment. Recognizing Hagia Sophia as a monument revered by both Christians and Muslims, Mehmet ordered its conversion into a mosque, renaming it Hagia Sophia Cami Kebir, the Great Mosque of Hagia Sophia. On Friday, June 1st, 1453, he attended the first prayer there, marking the beginning of a new era. After visiting Hagia Sophia, Mehmet went to see the remnants of the great palace of Byzantium, which lay in ruins along the Marmara shore. Gazing upon the shattered remains of imperial glory, he was moved to recite a melancholy verse by the Persian poet Sa'adi. The spider weaves the curtain in the palace of the Caesars. The owl sings its night song on the towers of Afrasiab. It was a somber reflection on the passing of empires and the fleeting nature of human greatness. Among the captured Byzantine nobility, Mehmet spared and adopted several young men of high birth, taking them into his service. According to the historian Critoboulos, he selected the most capable of them to serve as his pages and personal guards. 2 sons of Thomas Palaeologus, brother of the late Emperor Constantine XI, entered his household. Has Murat Pasha, who became one of Mehmet's closest companions, and Mesi Pasha, who later rose to high office and served as Grand Vizier under Sultan Bayezid II. Several other Christian converts also attained great power in Mehmet's administration, including Zaganos Pasha, Mahmud Pasha, Rum Mehmet Pasha, and Gedik Ahmet Pasha, all of whom would serve as Grand Viziers in the years to come. News of the city's fall reached Venice on June 29th, carried by a ship from Corfu. The next day, the Venetian Senate sent a grim message to Pope Nicholas V, describing the dreadful and most lamentable fall of the cities of Constantinople and Pera. When the Pope received the news on July 8th, he called it the shame of Christendom. 3 weeks after his victory, Mehmet left for Edirne, declaring it officially that from that day forward, his capital would be Istanbul. He appointed Karistran Süleyman Bey as the city's first governor, instructing him to oversee its rebuilding and repopulation. According to Critoboulos, Süleyman Bey was a capable and wise man who carried out his duties with great care. Mehmet then spent the summer in Edirne Palace, which he had expanded before the conquest. One of his first acts there was to order the execution of his old Grand Vizier, Sanderli Halil Pasha, whom he had long distrusted for betraying him to the Byzantines. With his death, Mehmet ended the dominance of the powerful Sanderli family and appointed Zaganos Pasha as his new Grand Vizier. When Mehmet returned to Istanbul, his first priority was to bring the city back to life. He issued imperial decrees calling for people from every corner of his realm, Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike, to settle in the city. Thousands were relocated from Asia and Europe to rebuild the capital. The non-Muslims were organized into millets, or communities, each led by their own religious head: the Greek Orthodox Patriarch, the Armenian Patriarch, and the Chief Rabbi. These leaders were granted broad authority over religious and civil affairs within their communities, forming the foundation of the Ottoman Empire's multi-ethnic and multi-religious system that would endure for centuries. Since the Greek Orthodox Patriarch had fled before the conquest, Mehmet personally ordered the election of a new one. The scholar and theologian George Scholarios was chosen and took the name Gennadios. Mehmet welcomed him warmly, sharing a meal and presenting him with a silver staff and a horse from his royal stables. He personally accompanied Gennadios part of the way to his new residence at the Church of the Holy Apostles, symbolically affirming his protection. A royal decree followed, guaranteeing the Patriarch freedom from taxes and interference, securing his authority over the Orthodox faithful. That same summer, Mehmet began rebuilding his new capital. He ordered the repair of the city walls and fortifications damaged during the siege. Since the Byzantine palaces were in ruins, he commissioned a new imperial residence on the third hill of the city, known as the Eski Saray, the Old Palace. Soon after, he ordered the construction of a massive fortress at the Golden Gate, later called Yedikule, or the Castle of Seven Towers. By 1456, Mehmet's projects had transformed the city. The Eski Saray and Yedikule were completed, and work began on the vast Kapalı Çarşı, the Grand Bazaar, destined to become one of the greatest marketplaces in the world. 6 years after the conquest of Constantinople, Sultan Mehmet II began transforming his new capital into a magnificent imperial city. According to the chronicler Critoboulos, he issued an imperial decree ordering all capable citizens to build splendid and costly structures within the city. He encouraged the construction of baths, inns, marketplaces, and beautiful workshops, as well as mosques and public buildings that would adorn and enrich Istanbul without regard for expense. Leading by example, Mehmet himself selected a site on the Fourth Hill and began constructing a vast mosque complex that became known as the Fatih Cami, the Mosque of the Conqueror. To make room for this grand project, he had the ancient Church of the Holy Apostles demolished, marking both a physical and symbolic transformation from Byzantine to Ottoman rule. Around the same time, Mehmet also commanded the construction of a new palace on the First Hill, which would later be known as Topkapı Sarayı, his imperial residence overlooking the Bosphorus. His grand viziers followed his lead, building their own mosque complexes throughout the city. The earliest and most famous of these was Mahmut Pasha Cami, erected in 1462 by Mahmut Pasha, who succeeded Zaganos Pasha as Grand Vizier 3 years after the conquest. Mahmut Pasha became one of the most capable and influential viziers in Ottoman history, though he ultimately shared the tragic fate of many powerful men, executed by the very sultan he served so loyally. These architectural projects marked the first stage in the transformation of Constantinople from a Byzantine Christian capital into the heart of the Ottoman Islamic Empire. The evolution can be clearly seen in the Buondelmonti maps of the 15th century. While the city's shape remained unchanged, its landmarks now included Rumeli Hisarı, Yedikule, Fatih Cami, Mahmut Pasha Cami, Eski Saray, Topkapı Sarayı, and the covered bazaar, along with the new minaret rising beside Hagia Sophia, the defining symbol of the city's rebirth as Ottoman Istanbul. Once his capital was firmly established, Mehmet turned his attention to expanding his empire through a series of campaigns. In the spring of 1454, he invaded Serbia and captured Novo Brdo, a wealthy mining town rich in gold and silver. 2 years later, however, he suffered a rare defeat during his unsuccessful siege of Belgrade. Despite this setback, his forces continued to advance, seizing the Genoese colonies of Nia and Paleo Focia on the Aegean coast, gaining control of their lucrative alum mines. In 1456, Ottoman troops under Umar Bey marched into Athens, ending Florentine rule. The defenders retreated to the Acropolis, but after 2 years of resistance, the city surrendered in June 1458. In the spring of that same year, Mehmet led his own expedition into the Peloponnesos, using the unpaid tribute of the Palaeologus brothers, Demetrius and Thomas, rulers of the Morea, as his justification. Corinth surrendered on August 2nd, and soon after, Thomas yielded Patras and other northern territories. On his return journey, Mehmet visited Athens, which deeply impressed him. Critoboulos records that the Sultan admired the ruins and reflected on the city's ancient glory, showing great appreciation for Greek culture and rewarding the Athenians generously for their loyalty. By 1459, Mehmet had launched a new campaign in Serbia, capturing Smederevo on June 20th without a fight. Within months, all of Serbia was under Ottoman control, and around 200,000 Serbs were enslaved, marking the beginning of more than 4 centuries of Ottoman rule in the region. Meanwhile, civil war broke out in the Peloponnesos between the Paleologus brothers. At first, Mehmet allowed his local commanders to manage the situation, but by May 1460, he personally led his army south from Edirne. Demetrius surrendered Mistra without resistance, and Mehmet quickly conquered the rest of the peninsula, sparing only the Venetian fortresses at Monemvasia, Koroni, Methoni, and Nauplion. When his troops captured the stronghold of Gardiki, he ordered the massacre of all 6,000 inhabitants, including women and children, a brutal act that terrified the remaining Greek towns into submission. Thomas Palaeologus fled to Corfu and later to Rome, bringing with him the sacred relic of St. Andrew's head, which he presented to Pope Pius II in 1462. He spent his final years as the Pope's guest, dying in Rome in 1465. His brother Demetrius, captured by Mehmet, was treated more leniently. He was given an estate in Enos, where he lived comfortably before retiring to a monastery and dying in 1470. While consolidating his power in the west, Mehmet turned his attention to the Black Sea. In 1459, he sent his Grand Vizier Mahmut Pasha to capture Amasra, a key Genoese port on the Anatolian coast. The city surrendered without a fight, and much of its population was enslaved and sent to Istanbul. 2 years later, in 1461, Mehmet launched a massive campaign against the last remnant of Byzantium, the Empire of Trebizond. Commanding an army of nearly 140,000 men and supported by a fleet of 300 ships, he besieged the city, which was ruled by Emperor David Comnenus. Facing overwhelming odds, David surrendered, and on August 15, 1461, Mehmet entered Trebizond, ending a Byzantine presence that had lasted for over a millennium. David and his family were allowed to live in Edirne, but in 1463, Mehmet ordered his execution along with 6 of his sons and a nephew, extinguishing the last surviving branch of the Byzantine imperial line. Only David's wife, Helena, and 2 of their children, George and Anna, were spared. George was raised as a Muslim, but later fled to Georgia, reverting to Christianity before vanishing from history. By the early 1460s, Mehmet the Conqueror had completed the work begun with the fall of Constantinople. He had absorbed the remaining Byzantine territories, brought the Black Sea under his control, and extended his dominion from the Adriatic to the Caucasus. In doing so, he became not merely the ruler of a powerful kingdom, but the master of 2 worlds, the sultan of the 2 continents and emperor of the 2 seas, the living symbol of an empire that had risen from the ashes of Byzantium to command both east and west. After taking Trebizond, Mehmet the Conqueror moved fast on new fronts. In spring 1462, he crushed a Wallachian revolt led by Vlad II Dracul, better known as Dracula, who fled to King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. That summer, Mehmet sailed with Grand Vizier Mahmud Pasha to Lesbos. After a 15-day siege, Mytilene fell. On the way, he stopped at ancient Troy, asked to see the tombs of Achilles and Ajax, praised their deeds and Homer's verses, and declared that he had now balanced the scales against the ancient Asiatics, defeated there by the Greeks. A struggle for the throne soon followed between Mehmet's sons Bayezid and Cem. Bayezid prevailed, forcing Cem to flee first to Cairo and later to Rhodes, where the Knights of St. John turned him into a political pawn, traded among popes and kings until his death in Naples in 1495. With his rival gone, Bayezid resumed Ottoman expansion. He captured Lepanto in 1499 after a short siege and seized the Venetian fortresses of Methone, Coroni, and Navarino by 1500, ending Venice's dominance in the Morea. The humiliating peace of 1502 marked the beginning of Venice's long maritime decline, and though Pope Alexander VI tried to rally a crusade, his sudden death ended the effort before it began. During the next decade, the empire turned east, fighting Persia, while Bayezid's health deteriorated. His sons Ahmet, Selim, and Korkut vied for succession. Selim, the most ambitious, marched from Anatolia to Edirne in 1511, bought the loyalty of the army, and forced his father's abdication on 23 April 1512. A month later, Bayezid died under suspicious circumstances, many believing that his physician poisoned him on Selim's orders. Now Sultan Selim I, called Yavuz, the Grim, he quickly eliminated all rivals, his brothers, nephews, and even 3 of his own sons, leaving only Suleiman as heir. Selim's reign brought calm to Europe, but conquest in Asia. He crushed Shah Ismail of Iran at Chaldiran in 1514, adding eastern Anatolia and western Persia to Ottoman lands, then defeated the Mamluks of Egypt in 1517, taking Cairo and uniting the Islamic world under his rule. Tradition held that the Caliph transferred his spiritual authority to Selim, making the Ottoman sultans guardians of both empire and faith. He next planned a European campaign, possibly against Hungary, but fell ill on the road to Edirne and died on the 22nd of September 1520, his general Ferhat Pasha keeping the death secret until Suleiman could seize power. Suleiman was 26 when he ascended the throne. Contemporary observers described him as intelligent, calm, and more humane than his father, raising hopes of a gentler era. Almost immediately, he prepared for war in Europe. In 1521, he captured Belgrade, gateway to the Danube lands, and the next year besieged Rhodes, which his great-grandfather Mehmet had failed to take. After 6 months of heroic resistance, the Knights of St. John surrendered in December 1522 and were allowed safe passage to Crete and later to Malta. Their departure opened the eastern Mediterranean to Ottoman dominance. While the Knights withdrew westward, power in Europe was shifting to Charles V of the Habsburg Empire, whose vast territories encircled France. When Francis I of France was captured at Pavia in 1525, he secretly appealed to Suleiman for aid, urging him to strike Hungary. The Sultan agreed, and on 29 August 1526 at Mohacs, he annihilated the Hungarian army in less than 2 hours, killing King Louis II and thousands of his men. The victory made Suleiman master of Central Europe. He then advanced on Vienna in 1529, but, after heavy losses, lifted the siege and withdrew before winter. Another attempt 3 years later reached only the Austrian frontier. Yet by then, Suleiman had already secured his place as the Magnificent, ruler of an empire that stretched from the Tigris to the Danube and stood as the greatest power of its age. Suleiman the Magnificent's failure to capture Vienna in 1529 marked the outer limit of Ottoman expansion into Europe, just as his unsuccessful siege of Malta in 1565 marked the boundary of Ottoman power in the Mediterranean. Though his armies dominated the Balkans and his fleets terrorized Christian waters, the loss of 35,000 men at Malta, including the famed commander Dragut Pasha, signaled that the age of unstoppable conquest was coming to an end. Suleiman himself died the following year, on the night of the 5th to the 6th of September 1566, while leading another campaign in Hungary. His reign, the longest and most glorious in Ottoman history, had carried the empire to its zenith, militarily, culturally, and politically, before the slow decline began. He was succeeded by his son, Selim II, known as the Sot, a ruler more devoted to wine and pleasure than to war or governance. Real power fell to his brilliant Grand Vizier, Sokolu Mehmet Pasha, who restored stability and rebuilt the navy after the crushing defeat at Lepanto in 1571. Within 2 years, the Ottomans seized Cyprus and soon after captured Tunis from Spain, proving that their empire still commanded fear across the seas. Yet Selim's drunken death in the palace baths in December 1574 began an era of weak rulers. His son Murat III secured his throne by murdering 5 of his brothers on his first day as sultan. When Sokolu Mehmet was assassinated in 1579, the government fell under the sway of the women of the imperial harem. This new age, known as the Sultanate of Women, saw powerful queen mothers and concubines dominate imperial politics. Among them, the most formidable was Kösem Sultan, a Greek woman who rose from slavery to become the de facto ruler of the empire through the reigns of her sons Murat IV and Ibrahim the Mad, and later her grandson Mehmet IV. Her eventual murder in 1651 by order of her rival Turhan Hadis ended one of the most dramatic power struggles in Ottoman history. Even after Kösem, the pattern continued. Turhan ruled as Queen Mother, and later Rabia Gulnus, another Greek woman, held influence through her sons Mustafa II and Ahmet III. Despite the internal decay, Ottoman arms still achieved flashes of greatness. Murat IV recaptured Baghdad in 1638, and under Mehmet IV, the empire finally conquered Crete in 1669 after a siege that had lasted more than 2 decades. But pride again led to disaster when Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha convinced Mehmet IV that Vienna could be taken. In 1683, the Ottoman army besieged the city for 2 months before being crushed by a united Christian force. Kara Mustafa was executed, and Mehmet IV was deposed 4 years later. The defeat inspired Europe's Christian monarchs to unite in the Holy League, Austria, Poland, and Venice, supported by Pope Innocent XI. Their combined forces waged war on the Ottomans for nearly 30 years. The conflict ended with the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, in which the empire ceded Hungary to Austria and the Morea to Venice, marking the first major loss of territory in Ottoman history. Later treaties deepened the decline. Passarowitz in 1718 stripped away more Balkan lands, and Küçük Kaynarka in 1774 handed Russia control over the Crimea and influence in the Balkans. By then, Europe had begun to call the empire the sick man of Europe, a shadow of its former might. The 19th century brought the final unraveling. In 1827, Britain, France, and Russia intervened in the Greek War of Independence, ensuring the birth of modern Greece 6 years later. At the same time, Egypt's ambitious governor, Mehmet Ali, began carving out his own kingdom, sending his son Ibrahim Pasha to march against the Ottoman heartland in 1831. What had once been the empire of Suleiman the Magnificent was now breaking apart. Its glory faded, its authority challenged, and its centuries-long dominance over 3 continents nearing its end. After his conquest of Trebizond, Sultan Mahmud's empire was shaken by new threats. In 1832, Mehmet Ali of Egypt and his brilliant son Ibrahim Pasha rebelled, sweeping through Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria before defeating 2 Ottoman armies and advancing deep into Anatolia. By February 1833, Ibrahim had reached Kütahya, only 150 miles from Istanbul. Terrified, Sultan Mahmud II appealed to Russia for help. Tsar Nicholas I sent warships to the Bosphorus, forcing Mehmet Ali to negotiate. The resulting peace gave Egypt control over Syria, Arabia, and Crete, while Russia gained influence through the Treaty of Hunkar-İskelesi, signed later that year. The treaty closed the Dardanelles to hostile powers and alarmed Britain and France, who now vowed to protect the Ottoman Empire from Russian expansion. In 1840, a new crisis erupted when the Ottoman admiral Ahmet Fevzi Pasha surrendered the entire Ottoman fleet to Mehmet Ali in Alexandria, fearing Russian control. The Ottoman foreign minister Mustafa Reşit Pasha sought help from the European powers, Britain, France, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, promising internal reform in return for their support. The great powers intervened, forcing Mehmet Ali to return the fleet in exchange for recognition as governor of an autonomous Egypt. True to his word, Sultan Abdülmecid, guided by Mustafa Reşit, issued the famous Gülhan Edict in 1839, proclaiming equality and justice for all subjects, Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike, and promising tax reform, a fair military draft, and the creation of legislative councils. This declaration marked the dawn of the Tanzimat, or Reformation era, a movement that sought to modernize and westernize the empire. The once great Ottoman Empire now lay in ruins. For 6 centuries, its rule had shaped the lives of Greeks, Armenians, Arabs, and Turks alike. Among these subjects were the Greeks of Anatolia, known to the Turks as Rum and to themselves as Romeoi, heirs to the Byzantine legacy of Hellenic culture and Orthodox Christianity. But after the conquest of Constantinople, their future darkened. Gennadios, the first patriarch under Ottoman rule, lamented that the church and its people had been stripped of freedom and power. He called on the clergy to preserve the nation's faith and knowledge, believing that only spiritual leadership could revive the Greek spirit. Over time, Greek culture survived only in fragments. Schools were rare, and in many remote areas, the people lost their language, speaking Turkish while clinging to their Orthodox faith. By the 15th century, only 17 metropolitan sees and 3 bishoprics remained in Anatolia. Centuries later, Western scholars observed the remnants of this once flourishing population. Isolated Orthodox communities scattered across central and eastern Anatolia, often bilingual and surrounded by a sea of Turks. Historian William Ramsay described them as the spiritual descendants of many ancient peoples, Cappadocians, Isaurians, Pamphylians, and men of Pontus, united only by their shared religion. Despite losing their language, the Anatolian Greeks saw themselves as true Hellenes, bound together by the Orthodox Church. In the words of Ramsay, these small Christian enclaves were like islands in a sea of Islam, yet they felt one with the Hellenes of Greece. Later writers, like Spyridon Lambros, spoke mournfully of these last remnants of a Christian civilization submerged by centuries of conquest. When Greeks from the islands and mainland began resettling Anatolia in later centuries, they found no trace of their ancestral culture. No churches, no Greek names, only Turkish villages standing where Greek life had once flourished. According to official Ottoman records examined by the Turkish historian Ömer Lütfi Barkan, between 1520 and 1535, there were about 78,783 Christian households in Anatolia, roughly 400,000 people. This population included Greeks, Armenians, and other Christians. At that time, Anatolia's total population was estimated at 5 million, meaning Christians made up about 8%. Over the next 50 years, that number nearly doubled in western Anatolia, largely due to the arrival of Greek settlers who came through Izmir, which had once again become the main port of the Aegean coast after the Turkish conquest of Chios in 1566. From Izmir, these settlers spread inland along the valleys of the Gidis and Menderes rivers, the same ancient routes once followed by early Greek colonists thousands of years earlier. Some moved north along the coast to repopulate ancient regions like Ionia, Aeolia, and the Troad, reviving Greek towns that had long been deserted. Historical records from 1586 show that Greek laborers were even brought to the Troad to help build the Ottoman fortress of Kumkale at the entrance of the Dardanelles. Many of these workers settled permanently in nearby villages, including Yenisehir and Nikor, on the ridge overlooking the plain of ancient Troy, near the legendary burial mounds of Achilles and Patroclus. Centuries later, local Turks still remembered their Greek neighbors with fondness before their departure during the population exchange of 1923. Before this influx, many of the once glorious Greek cities of Asia Minor had been reduced to small, struggling communities. When the German traveler Dernschwam visited Nicaea in 1555, he found only 11 Greek inhabitants and one illiterate priest. 2 decades later, the visitor Stefan Gerlach heard that about 50 small Greek communities existed around Nicaea, but within the city itself, the population remained tiny. In 1677, the Anglican chaplain John Koval recorded that there were no more than 10 Greek families left in Nicaea, along with about 50 Armenians, while the rest were Turks. He noted sadly that the Greeks had forgotten their own language, speaking only Turkish. Even the local priest could barely recite prayers he didn't understand. In southern Anatolia, the Greeks of Antalya, Side, and Myra were descended from both local survivors and newer arrivals who had lived through centuries of Ottoman dominance in secret. Many of these immigrants were Turkish-speaking Greeks from Isparta who had crossed the Taurus Mountains. By the late 17th century, however, even these Turcophone communities began to reintroduce Greek education and books imported from Venice. Further north, in Bursa, once the first Ottoman capital, the French traveler Joseph Tournefort found about 300 Greek families in 1702, barely 2% of the city's total population, though the city had been entirely Greek before the conquest. In central Anatolia, Greek and Christian populations began to grow again after the mid-16th century, often due to migration. Records show the number of Christian families doubling or tripling in cities like Ankara, Kastamonu, and Çankırı, while new Christian communities appeared in previously all Muslim towns like Bolu. By the 17th century, observers like the French geographer V. Quesnay noted that the Greeks of central Anatolia descended partly from ancient Paphlagonians and partly from merchants who had moved inland from Kayseri and Ankara. Izmir, or Smyrna, had been nearly deserted during the late Byzantine period, with only about 1,000 inhabitants in 1528, of whom roughly 150 were Greeks. But as the Ottomans expanded trade after their conquests of Egypt and Rhodes in the early 16th century, Izmir began to flourish once more. By the mid-17th century, it had grown into a bustling port city of about 80,000 people, 50,000 Turks, 15,000 Greeks, 7,000 Armenians, 7,000 Jews, and 1,000 Europeans. The capture of Chios in 1566 brought many wealthy Chiot merchants to the city, cementing Izmir's role as the empire's second most important port after Istanbul. During the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottomans began granting trade privileges to European nations. His successors continued this policy. Sultan Murat III even wrote to Queen Elizabeth I, assuring her that English merchants would be protected in Ottoman lands. This led to the establishment of the Levant Company in 1581, an English trading enterprise that set up bases in Izmir and Istanbul, opening a new chapter in East-West commerce. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, travelers described Izmir as a vibrant cosmopolitan city filled with trade, music, and life. The Dutch explorer Cornelis de Bruyn called it the premier city of the Levant, while Tournefort marveled at its lively taverns where Turks, Greeks, and Europeans mingled freely. The English traveler Richard Pocock, visiting in 1739, counted over 100,000 residents, mostly Turks, but also thousands of Greeks, Jews, Armenians, and European merchants known as factors. He described a city divided into distinct quarters, but rich with diversity, its churches, synagogues, and mosques standing side by side. Later, Richard Chandler, another English antiquarian who traveled through the region in the 1760s, noted how Europeans often intermarried with Greeks, creating a unique cultural blend that made the city known among Turks as Gavur Izmir, infidel Izmir. He admired the beauty of the Greek women who had come from Aegean islands like the Tinos, praising their sun-kissed charm and grace. As he journeyed up the coast, Chandler found small Greek villages still clinging to ancient lands, some near Troy itself, where he described the simple Greek hamlet of Yenisehir as poor but enduring, a faint echo of a once glorious civilization that had never completely faded from the plains of Asia Minor. In Cappadocia, the heart of central Anatolia, the Greek population gradually declined during the 19th century as many left their mountain villages for Istanbul and the coast in search of work. Church records from Caesarea, the old capital of the region, show that nearly 60% of able-bodied Greek men migrated elsewhere. Census data reflected this trend. By 1923, the Greek population of Kayseri had fallen to fewer than 900, compared to 3,000 in 1890, while the Turkish population had increased. Yet amid this decline, the town of Sinissos stood out as a remarkable center of learning and culture. Even as neighboring Greek communities lost their language, Sinissos kept the flame of Hellenism alive through its schools, a boys' school founded in 1840 and a girls' school in 1872, where students studied Greek, Turkish, French, mathematics, history, religion, and the arts. These schools were so advanced that they drew students from distant cities like Kayseri and Konya. The Greek-speaking Orthodox Christians of Cappadocia, who had adopted Turkish as their daily language, became known as the Karamanlides. Scholars have long debated their origins. Some believed they were Greeks who had been linguistically Turkified under Ottoman rule, while others thought they were Turks who had converted to Christianity but retained their native language. Most modern researchers conclude that the Karamanlides were originally Byzantine Greeks, who gradually lost their language while keeping their faith and adapting to Turkish customs. By the late 19th century, efforts were made to reconnect these Anatolian Greeks with the wider Hellenic world. The Society of Anatolians, the East, founded in Athens in 1891, sponsored young students from Anatolia to study in Greek universities or academies in Istanbul and Izmir. They were then expected to return and teach in their home regions, helping to restore the use of the Greek language. The society promoted a pure and classical form of Greek, the katarevousa, as the true heritage of Plato and Aristotle, hoping to cleanse the language of what they called barbarous influences. Izmir, the vibrant cosmopolitan port of Western Anatolia, became the cultural and educational heart of Greek life in Asia Minor. Its evangelical school, founded in 1728, was one of the most prestigious Greek institutions in the Ottoman world. By the late 19th century, it oversaw several primary schools, a gymnasium, and even a commercial academy, serving around 1,400 students. Alongside it were numerous private Greek schools and missionary institutions, making Izmir a beacon of Hellenic education and prosperity. Yet, in the more remote interior of Anatolia, these efforts had little effect. Many Orthodox communities had long since shifted to Turkish, though church services continued in Greek. In some places, priests translated prayers into Turkish so their congregations could understand them, a poignant sign of faith surviving through language loss. Beyond Cappadocia, another group of hidden Christians lived in the Pontus Mountains near Trebizond. These people, known later as crypto-Christians, had outwardly converted to Islam after the Ottoman conquest, but secretly practiced Christianity for centuries. Their existence was first mentioned as early as the 14th century, when Patriarch John IV urged those forced to convert to hold their faith in secret within their hearts. Over time, many of these hidden Christians blended into the Muslim population, though they continued to speak Greek and quietly maintain their traditions. By the mid-19th century, their numbers in the Pontus were estimated at around 17,000. The British Vice-Consul George Stevens described entire villages, such as Kromny and Matska, where these crypto-Christians lived in fear yet clung to their identity. When Sultan Abdülmecid proclaimed religious freedom in 1856, they began to re-emerge, openly declaring their faith and building nearly 1,000 new churches in the region. But their newfound visibility came with a cost. Christians were no longer exempt from military service, and many young men fled to Greece or Russia rather than serve in the Ottoman army. By the time British scholar R.M. Dawkins visited the Pontus in 1914, he found the Christian villages almost devoid of adult men, sustained only by women, priests, and teachers. He described a haunting scene, the remnants of a once vibrant Byzantine people who had survived centuries of oppression through secrecy and endurance. Yet even their resilience could not withstand the storms of the 20th century. The decade that followed, marked by World War I and its aftermath, brought the final destruction of the Greek presence in Anatolia, ending a chapter of history that had begun thousands of years earlier, when Hellenic civilization first took root in the heart of Asia Minor. When the modern Greek kingdom was first established in 1833, it was only a small state comprising the southern mainland and the central Aegean islands. Its northern border stretched from the Gulf of Lamia to the Gulf of Arta, while vast regions like Epirus, Thessaly, Macedonia, Thrace, Crete, Cyprus, and the eastern Aegean islands remained under Ottoman control. In fact, there were nearly 3 times as many Greeks living under Ottoman rule as within the new Greek kingdom itself. This imbalance inspired a powerful national movement, the Megali idea, or Great Idea, a vision of uniting all Greeks in one state and restoring the old Byzantine capital, Constantinople, as the heart of a revived Hellenic empire. The megali idea was passionately articulated in 1844 by Ioannis Koletis, who declared that the kingdom of Greece was only the smallest and poorest part of Greece. To him, every Greek, whether from Ioannina, Thessaloniki, Constantinople, or Trebizond, was part of a greater nation bound by a shared language, culture, and faith. The dream was clear. Athens might be the capital of the kingdom, but Constantinople was the great capital, the spiritual center and symbol of national destiny. The revival of Greece was thus not only political, but also historical, rooted in both classical Hellenism and Byzantine Orthodoxy, which had survived centuries of Ottoman domination under the protection of the Orthodox Church. The Greek state gradually expanded throughout the 19th century. In 1864, Britain ceded the Ionian Islands to Greece, and in 1881, the Ottomans, under pressure from the great powers, handed over most of Thessaly and parts of Epirus. By 1913, after the Balkan Wars, Greece gained southern Epirus, Macedonia, Thessaloniki, and several Aegean islands, increasing its territory by 70% and nearly doubling its population. Yet millions of Greeks still lived in Ottoman lands, in Asia Minor, Constantinople, and the Pontus, where they were often caught in waves of persecution and forced resettlement. During the Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913, the Ottoman Empire lost most of its European provinces, while hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees from the Balkans fled into Anatolia. Many of these refugees took revenge on local Christian communities, including Greeks, forming armed bands known as Shetes, who carried out attacks across western Anatolia. The forced displacements that followed marked the beginning of a brutal cycle of ethnic cleansing that would continue into the First World War. When Turkey entered the war on the side of Germany, German commander Lyman von Sanders ordered the removal of Greek populations from the Aegean coast, claiming it was necessary for military security. Thousands were driven inland under appalling conditions. Entire communities like Ayvalık were emptied, their men sent to the interior or to forced labor. A British intelligence report from 1918 estimated that over 1.5 million people were deported from Thrace and Anatolia, with half dying from hunger, disease, or violence. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, Greek Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos reported that 300,000 Greeks had been killed and nearly 500,000 forced to flee to Greece. With the Ottoman Empire collapsing and Allied troops occupying Istanbul, Venizelos saw an opportunity to realize the megali idea. At the peace talks, Greece claimed Western Asia Minor, the fertile and historic coastal region surrounding Izmir, arguing that it had a large Greek population and deep Hellenic roots. The proposed Greek zone stretched from Ayvalık to the Meander River, embracing the ancient heartland of Ionia. For Venizelos, this was more than a territorial claim. It was the rebirth of Hellenism in its ancestral homeland. The Allies, eager to prevent Italy from gaining influence in Anatolia, supported the Greek plan. In May 1919, Britain's Lloyd George, France's Clemenceau, and U.S. President Woodrow Wilson authorized a Greek landing at Izmir to secure the region before the Italians could advance from Antalya. Thus, Greece's Asia Minor campaign began, a bold but fateful step toward the dream of a Greater Greece, which aimed to unite all Greeks under one flag and restore the glory of Byzantium. In May 1919, with the backing of British Prime Minister Lloyd George and French leader Georges Clemenceau, Eleftherios Venizelos launched the long-planned Greek expedition to Asia Minor. On the 14th of May, a fleet of Greek, French, and British ships arrived at Izmir, and the next morning Greek soldiers began landing to cheering crowds of local Greeks. The arrival quickly turned bloody. As the troops marched through Konak Square, a Turkish civilian fired a single shot that killed the Greek flag-bearer. The soldiers retaliated by opening fire on Turkish troops and civilians, turning the port city into chaos. By the end of the day, between 300 and 400 Turks and about 100 Greeks were dead. Venizelos immediately appointed Aristides Stergiadis as governor of Smyrna to restore order. Stergiadis established a strict but fair administration, punishing those responsible for the violence and ensuring equal treatment for both Greeks and Turks. Under his direction, 100,000 refugees were resettled, an experimental farm and a university were founded, and Smyrna began to flourish again as a cultural center. Meanwhile, the Greek army, now about 120,000 strong, advanced deep into western Anatolia with little resistance, reaching up the valleys of the Meander and Hermus rivers and occupying towns as far north as Ayvalık. While the Ottoman government of Sultan Mehmet VI continued to exist under Allied supervision in Istanbul, a new nationalist movement was emerging in Anatolia under Mustafa Kemal Pasha. In March 1920, he announced the creation of a new parliament, the Grand National Assembly, in Ankara, which first met in April and elected him president. The Ottoman Empire now effectively had two governments, one imperial and submissive, the other nationalist and defiant. That same year, two Allied investigations were launched into the situation in Asia Minor. One, led by General George Milne, set the boundaries of the Greek occupation zone from Ayvalık to Aden, warning that any Greek advance beyond this Milne line would face strong Turkish resistance. The second, the Inter-Allied Commission of Inquiry, condemned the Greek army for atrocities committed during the landings and in their inland campaign. It concluded that Turkish nationalism would never accept Greek annexation except through force, something Greece alone could not sustain. Venizelos ignored this warning, convinced that his 12 Greek divisions could easily crush Mustafa Kemal's 70,000 irregulars. In June 1920, the Greeks crossed the Milne Line, advancing along four fronts. They captured Bandırma, Bursa, and Uşak, while another army invaded eastern Thrace, nearly reaching Istanbul before Allied pressure forced them to halt. On the 10th of August 1920, the Treaty of Sèvres officially dismantled the Ottoman Empire, granting Thrace and Izmir to Greece under a 5-year mandate. The agreement was celebrated in Athens but rejected by the Turkish nationalists, who viewed it as a death sentence for their homeland. Encouraged by Lloyd George, the Greeks pressed further into Anatolia in late 1920. But Venizelos's government soon collapsed after King Alexander's death. The exiled King Constantine returned, Venizelos fled, and a royalist administration replaced his officers with inexperienced loyalists. The Greek army, weakened by political purges, now faced a reorganized and determined Turkish force. By early 1921, the Greeks reached Eskişehir, but after heavy fighting, they were forced to retreat. Two successive defeats at the First and Second Battles of İnönü, led by İsmet Pasha, marked the first major Turkish victories. Despite this, the Allies continued to encourage Greece, hoping the campaign would pressure both the Sultan and the nationalists into signing the Treaty of Sèvres. In June 1921, King Constantine personally took command and arrived in Izmir to lead a massive new offensive. The Greeks captured Kütahya and again advanced toward Eskişehir, But Mustafa Kemal, now commander-in-chief, ordered a strategic withdrawal toward Ankara, preparing to make a final stand along the Sakarya River. The decisive Battle of Sakarya began on 23 August 1921. The Greeks pushed to within 25 miles of Ankara, fighting across the Phrygian highlands, within sight of the ancient tombs of the Lydian kings. For 2 weeks the battle raged. On the 8th of September, the Turks counterattacked, and by the 11th of September, the exhausted Greek army, having lost over 20,000 men, was forced into a full retreat back to Eskişehir. After their defeat at Sakarya, the Greeks withdrew to their old defensive lines, and for nearly a year the war in Asia Minor settled into a tense stalemate. Attempts were made to negotiate peace, but the Turkish nationalists under Mustafa Kemal refused any armistice unless the Greeks agreed to a complete withdrawal from Asia Minor. Among some Greek circles, a desperate idea emerged: the Mikrasiatiki Amina, or Asia Minor Defense, which envisioned creating an independent Greek state in western Anatolia with Smyrna as its capital. Yet this plan never took shape, and morale among the Greek troops continued to crumble as months of uncertainty dragged on. Meanwhile, Mustafa Kemal and his commanders were quietly rebuilding their army. By the summer of 1922, Turkish forces were fully prepared for a decisive counteroffensive. At dawn, on the 26th of August 1922, the Turkish army launched what became known as the Büyük Taarruz, or Great Offensive, attacking along a vast front from Izmit to Afyon. Within days, Turkish forces broke through Greek defenses. Izmit fell on the first day, and at Dumlupinar, 30 miles west of Afyon, the Greek army was decisively crushed. Nearly half of the Greek forces were killed or captured, including General Trikoupis, who learned only after his surrender that he had been appointed commander-in-chief. The Turkish advance was relentless. Eskişehir fell on the 2nd of September, and when the Greek government in Athens asked Britain to mediate a truce that would at least allow them to keep Smyrna, Mustafa Kemal refused. The towns of Balıkesir, Aydın, and Manisa fell in rapid succession, the latter set ablaze by retreating Greek forces. On the 9th of September, Turkish cavalry entered Izmir, greeted by cheering crowds of Turks, as the city that had symbolized the Megali idea now marked its fiery end. Within 2 days, the ports of Gemlik and Mudanya also surrendered. The Greek army retreated in chaos, many units fleeing towards the Aegean coast. Some escaped from Çeşme to Chios, others from Bandırma and Mudanya across the Sea of Marmara to Thrace, while smaller groups fled to Lesbos and Dikili. By 19th September, the last Greek soldiers had been evacuated, leaving behind a devastated land where both sides had committed atrocities. Tens of thousands of Greek civilians poured onto the roads toward the coast, seeking passage across the sea. American observers reported that by early September, as many as 30,000 refugees a day were arriving in Izmir, desperate to find space on any vessel in the harbor. Mustafa Kemal entered Izmir on the 10th of September, leading a column of cavalry to the same government building, the Konak, where the first shots of the war had been fired 3 years earlier. But the city was already descending into chaos. Looting and killings began on the night of the 9th of September, and over the following days, thousands of Greeks and Armenians were murdered. Among the victims was Metropolitan Chrysostomos of Smyrna, who was seized by a mob and brutally killed. Then, on the afternoon of the 13th of September, fire broke out in the Armenian quarter. Fanned by the wind, it spread with terrifying speed, engulfing the Greek and European districts while leaving the Turkish and Jewish quarters untouched. The inferno that consumed Smyrna became one of the most haunting scenes in modern history. The British journalist Ward Price, watching from the warship HMS Iron Duke, described the city as a 2-mile wall of fire, vomiting flames 100 feet high, with the screams of tens of thousands trapped between the sea and the burning streets. The sea itself glowed red with reflection as refugees hurled themselves into the water, trying to reach foreign ships anchored offshore. The death toll remains uncertain. Admiral Mark Bristol, the American High Commissioner in Istanbul, estimated around 2,000 deaths, while George Horton, the U.S. consul in Izmir, claimed as many as 100,000 people perished in the massacre and fire, blaming Turkish troops for systematically burning the Christian quarters. Whatever the true number, the destruction of Smyrna marked the final collapse of the Greek dream in Asia Minor. After the fall of Izmir, the Turkish nationalist army advanced rapidly toward the Bosphorus, the Sea of Marmara, and the Dardanelles, regions still under Allied occupation by British, French, and Italian troops. As the Turkish forces approached the straits, the French and Italians quickly withdrew, leaving the British to face the advancing Turks alone. General Charles Harrington, the Allied commander in Istanbul, wisely ordered his men not to open fire, preventing another war. The Greek navy withdrew at Britain's request, and the British government pressured Greece to retreat beyond the Maritsa River in Thrace. This convinced Mustafa Kemal to accept negotiations for an armistice, which was signed at Mudanya on the 11th of October, 1922. The agreement allowed Turkish nationalist forces to occupy eastern Thrace, except for Istanbul and the narrow zone along the straits that remained under temporary British control. Shortly after, on the 1st of November 1922, the Grand National Assembly in Ankara took a historic step by abolishing the Sultanate, separating it from the Caliphate and reducing the latter to a symbolic religious office under state authority. Sultan Mehmet VI Vahidettin, realizing his rule was over, fled Istanbul aboard the British battleship HMS Malaya on the 17th of November, never to return. His cousin, Abdülmecid II, was appointed caliph a week later. The final peace agreement, the Treaty of Lausanne, was signed on 24th July 1923, establishing the modern borders of the Republic of Turkey, except for the province of Hatay, which joined later in 1939. The Allied occupation of Istanbul formally ended on the 2nd of October 1923, when the last British troops departed. 4 days later, Turkish nationalist forces marched triumphantly into the city. On the 13th of October, Ankara was officially declared the capital, and 2 weeks later, on the 29th of October 1923, the Assembly proclaimed the Republic of Turkey. Mustafa Kemal was elected its first president, and İsmet İnönü, his trusted general, became prime minister. Mustafa Kemal later adopted the name Atatürk, meaning Father of the Turks, symbolizing the birth of a new secular nation rising from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire. İnönü's own surname honored his victories in the battles of İnönü during the War of Independence. To complete the transformation, on March 3, 1924, the Assembly abolished the Caliphate, permanently ending any remaining ties to the Ottoman past. Abdülmecid II and the entire Ottoman royal family were exiled, marking the final fall of the House of Osman, which had ruled for more than 7 centuries. The age of the Ottoman sultans had ended, replaced by a modern, republican Turkey. Meanwhile, in Greece, the Asia Minor catastrophe sparked revolution. King Constantine was forced to abdicate again, replaced by his son, George II. A revolutionary tribunal in Athens sought to assign blame for the disaster, and 6 senior political and military leaders, including Demetrios Gounaris, were tried for treason and executed by firing squad on the 28th of November, 1922. The same revolutionary government appointed Eleftherios Venizelos to represent Greece in peace negotiations with the Allies and with the new Turkish state. On the 30th of January 1923, Venizelos and İsmet İnönü signed an agreement at Lausanne that established a compulsory population exchange between Greece and Turkey. Under the terms of the convention, all Greek Orthodox Christians living in Turkey and all Muslims living in Greece were required to relocate permanently to their respective countries. Only the Greeks of Istanbul and the Turks of Western Thrace were exempt. This massive exchange uprooted entire communities that had lived side by side for centuries. Many Greeks fled long before the agreement took effect. Foreign correspondents, including a young Ernest Hemingway, described heartbreaking scenes of refugees trudging through the rain, pushing carts loaded with their belongings, and carrying their children across the cold plains of eastern Thrace as they crossed into Greece. His reports for the Toronto Star captured the despair of a people forced to abandon their homeland forever. The humanitarian crisis was overwhelming. The American Red Cross initially provided emergency aid, but by March 1923, it had to withdraw. Soon after, the Norwegian statesman Fridtjof Nansen, representing the League of Nations, organized the Refugee Settlement Commission, RSC, to manage the resettlement effort. Chaired by former U.S. Ambassador Henry Morgenthau, the commission worked tirelessly to feed, shelter, and relocate hundreds of thousands of displaced people across Greece. Morgenthau later described the horror of seeing thousands of starving, disease-ridden refugees arriving by ship from Asia Minor, packed so tightly that many could neither sit nor sleep for days. By April 1924, the RSC estimated that around 786,000 Greek refugees had already reached Greece, most of them women and children, as many men had died in war or forced labor. Over the next year, another 350,000 arrived, along with 100,000 Armenian refugees. By the time of the 1928 census, Greece had absorbed more than 1.2 million refugees, a staggering number for a small country. The population exchange increased Greece's total population by nearly 1/3 and transformed its ethnic makeup. The Greek share rose from 80% in 1920 to 94% in 1928, making it one of the most homogeneous nations in southeastern Europe. At the same time, about 400,000 Muslims from Greece were resettled in Turkey, many occupying the homes of the departed Greeks in Thrace and Anatolia. Ironically, many of the Greeks who arrived in Greece spoke only Turkish, while many of the Turks arriving in Turkey spoke only Greek, a tragic reminder of how deeply intertwined these two ancient peoples had once been, before history and politics forced them apart forever. During the Lausanne Conference, the fate of the Turkish-speaking Greek Orthodox communities, known as the Karamanlides, became a topic of debate. British Foreign Secretary Lord Curzon argued that these so-called reconciled Ottoman Greeks, numbering around 50,000, should be exempt from the population exchange between Greece and Turkey. Both İsmet İnönü and Eleftherios Venizelos shared this view, describing the Karamanlides as loyal Orthodox Turks who had always lived peacefully alongside their Muslim neighbors. However, despite these intentions, almost all of the Karamanlides were included in the compulsory exchange. except for one group led by a priest named Papa Eftim Karahisaridis from the village of Keskin near Ankara. Papa Eftim had supported the Turkish nationalists during the War of Independence, and in gratitude, he and his followers were allowed to stay in Turkey, moving to Istanbul instead of being deported. In Istanbul, Papa Eftim took over an old Greek church in Galata and declared himself the head of a new Turkish Orthodox church, where the liturgy was conducted in Turkish rather than Greek. Although the ecumenical patriarch Melitios IV initially proposed a compromise, offering the church autonomy under the patriarchate, Eftim rejected all authority from Constantinople. In 1924, he established his own patriarchate, took the Turkish name Zeki Erenerol, and led his church independently until his death in 1968. The church was later passed down to his sons and eventually to his grandson, Papa Eftim IV, who still represents the movement today. Meanwhile, the Muslim refugees arriving from Greece were resettled across eastern Thrace and along the Aegean and Mediterranean coasts. In the 1960s, many of the older settlers could still be heard speaking Greek, a reminder of their origins. Families from Lesbos, Mytilene, were relocated mainly around Ayvalık, often moving into the very homes once owned by departing Greek families. Contemporary reports described deeply emotional scenes at the docks as Greek and Turkish neighbors who had shared villages, farmlands, and even cafe games for generations embraced each other in tears before parting forever. By 1930, the Refugee Settlement Commission, RSC, had completed its mission, having successfully resettled more than 570,000 refugees in Greece's agricultural regions, while the government settled an additional 8,000. Over the next few years, another 167,000 found homes in new farming communities, particularly in Macedonia and Thrace, where they replaced the Muslim and Bulgarian populations that had been exchanged. Sir John Campbell, vice chairman of the RSC, later described how dramatically the Greek countryside had been transformed. Once barren plains were now filled with lively new villages, red-roofed houses, and thriving fields cultivated by hard-working refugee families. Yet nearly half of the refugees ended up in urban centers. By 1930, Athens, Piraeus, and Thessaloniki each absorbed more than 100,000 people. With few resources, these cities turned theaters, churches, schools, and warehouses into makeshift shelters. Entire families lived in cramped boxes of the Royal Theatre of Athens, classrooms, and candlelit churches, sleeping under Byzantine icons. Over time, new suburbs such as Nea Smyrni, Nea Philadelphia, and Nea Ionia grew from these settlements, each named after the Asia Minor towns their inhabitants had lost. Despite these efforts, tens of thousands of refugee families still lived in poverty in shantytowns well into the 1930s. The Great Depression and later the German occupation during World War II deepened their misery, and these neighborhoods often became centers of resistance and political radicalism, especially for the Greek Communist Party. British diplomat Sir Reginald Leeper, writing in 1950, recalled visiting these poor suburbs during the civil unrest of December 1944, describing them as densely packed, impoverished districts where the Asia Minor refugees had been resettled decades earlier. Amid hardship, the refugees preserved their Anatolian culture through music, poetry, and memory. Their songs gave birth to Rebetika, often called the Greek blues, and the mournful Amanades, emotional laments sung with the bouzouki in the cafes of Piraeus. These songs expressed the deep longing for their lost homeland. Smyrna, Ayvalık, and the valleys of Asia Minor. One Rebettica song pleads, "Cheer up, my refugee girl, forget your misfortune, for one day we shall return to our lovely Smyrna and rebuild our nest." Another folk song captures the heartbreak of exile. "What is it to you where I come from, Karatasi or Cordelio? In my land they know how to love and to hide their sorrow. I came from Smyrna to find comfort, to find in Athens a loving embrace." Many refugees later emigrated to America, Canada, and Australia, taking with them the dances, music, and memories of Asia Minor. Among them was the grandmother of Sophia Bilids, a Greek-American singer from Boston who kept alive the songs of Ivaluk, including one that mournfully praises her lost village with its silver doors, golden keys, and girls as fresh as cool water. This enduring nostalgia became part of the Greek identity known as Romeosini, a word that embodies the spirit of the Byzantine and Anatolian Greeks, their resilience, and their longing for home. In one of the most famous laments, "Smyrna is burning," a refugee poet mourns. "Smyrna is burning, mother, our livelihood in flames, our dreams vanishing. Romeosini, when will you rest? You live 1 year in peace and 30 in fire." Today, the only Greek Orthodox citizens left in Turkey number roughly 2,000, concentrated in Istanbul and on the Aegean islands of Imbros, now called Gökçeada, and Tenedos, now Bozkada. Turks still call them Rum, and they call themselves Romaioi, heirs to an empire gone for more than 5 centuries. In the mountains above Trabzon, a few thousand Muslim villagers continue to speak Greek at home, descendants of communities that converted to Islam after the Ottoman conquest. Izmir's vast fire of 1922 is now a memory more than a scar. Rebuilding was slow, and as late as the early 1960s, charred gaps were visible, but the city has since been completely transformed. With a population above 3 million, Izmir faces the Aegean and feels culturally closer to Europe than most Turkish cities. Its universities, Ege and Dokuz Eylül in the public system, alongside the Izmir University of Economics, Yaşar University, and the Izmir Institute of Technology, educate tens of thousands. The late summer International Trade Fair fills Kültür Park, itself laid out on the site of the Greek and Armenian districts lost to the flames, while the Izmir International Festival brings orchestras, ballet, jazz, and soloists to stages in the city and at ancient venues such as Ephesus. Archaeology keeps resurfacing the city's older selves. At Bayraklı, northeast of the Gulf, excavations show settlement as early as the 3rd millennium BCE, contemporaneous with the earliest layers at Troy. Greek settlers arrived in the 10th century BCE, evidenced by proto-geometric pottery, and an archaic temple of Athena from about 640 BCE has been called one of the earliest and finest monuments of Eastern Greek architecture in Asia Minor. A spring on the Meles, associated since antiquity with Homer, was long venerated for its healing waters. The skyline's best vantage point is Kadafakale, the Velvet Castle, crown of Mount Pagos. The surviving fortifications belong to successive Roman, Byzantine, and Ottoman phases, but they recall the Hellenistic city that took shape here in the wake of Alexander's dream. Down the slope, the Roman-era agora, rebuilt after the earthquake of 178 under Empress Faustina, survives as an open-air museum with a grand vaulted substructure, arcaded shopfronts, and inscriptions that once hailed Smyrna as First of Asia. Statues of Poseidon and Demeter from the site, symbols of sea trade and agriculture, rest in the city's archaeological museum. Ephesus, the great magnet for visitors, lies by Selçuk. 19th and 20th century excavations uncovered the Artemis Temple's foundations and restored streets, theaters, and civic buildings that narrate nearly 2 millennia of life. The cult of Artemis, likely layered over an earlier Anatolian mother goddess, later yielded to the veneration of the Virgin Mary. Justinian's Basilica of St. John rose above the old sanctuary and furnished stones for the 14th century Isa Bey Mosque below when Byzantium waned and Turkish beyliks took hold. Today, only one re-erected column marks the vast footprint of the Artemisium, crowned by the nest of a resident stork. Ephesus's Greek population drifted to the surrounding hills in early Ottoman times, creating villages like Kirkense. After 1922, its Greek residents were resettled in Thessaly, where they founded Nea Ephesus and carried with them language, festivals, and memories of the Aegean valleys. Muslim families from Kavala moved into Kirkinç, which is now Şirinç. Into the 1960s, many elders there still spoke Greek and remembered their own lost homes across the sea. These mirrored migrations capture the twin currents of departure and arrival that reshaped the region. Closer to Izmir, the ancient Ionian city of Klazomenai survives as modern Urla. It was the birthplace of Anaxagoras around 500 BCE, the philosopher who carried Ionian science to Athens and taught Pericles while offering one of the first sustained natural explanations of the cosmos after the early Milesians. This is the arc of Western Asia Minor today, a modern, outward-looking Izmir layered over archaic Smyrna, sacred springs and shattered agoras alongside universities and trade fairs, abandoned sanctuaries reborn as churches and mosques, and villages renamed yet still haunted by songs and stories of the people who once called them home. George Seferis, one of Greece's most celebrated poets, was born in the seaside town of Urla, known in Greek as Vurla, on February 29, 1900. His family moved to Athens in 1914, where he completed his education before studying law in Paris. In 1963, he became the first Greek writer to receive the Nobel Prize in Literature, honored for reviving modern Greek poetry through works that bridged the ancient and modern worlds. When he returned to his birthplace in 1950 after decades away, the visit filled him with nostalgia and pain. His poem, Memory 2, recalls wandering through the ruins of Ephesus, imagining ancient theaters once alive with voices now fallen silent. In his journal, Seferis described his old house in Scala as abandoned and decaying, its windows shattered, its walls peeling, and the whole neighborhood lifeless, as if the little life left in them depended on me alone. His later trip to Smyrna was equally haunting. He walked through a city both familiar and foreign, whispering to himself that Smyrna must be such an urn for me. No one can return Izmir's rocky islets known as the Two Brothers, still visible across the gulf, became symbols in his poetry, glowing with the light of an inexhaustible love as the sun set behind them. Seferis's personal journey reflected the larger story of Greek memory in Anatolia, a land once covered with thousands of Hellenic cities. Ancient maps list more than 2,400 Greek settlements within modern Turkey, from the famous ruins of Ephesus and Miletus to hidden sites like Ege, where moss-covered temples rest in silence among olive groves. Many Byzantine churches were later built upon or from these classical ruins, reminders of continuous layers of civilization that rose, flourished, and fell across millennia. The Greek presence in Anatolia had endured for over 3,000 years, stretching back to Mycenaean burials found on the plain of Troy near the tumulus of Achilles. Standing there today, surrounded by Ottoman tombstones and the quiet hills of Yenisehir, one can still feel that unbroken chain of human memory, from the age of Homer to the migrations of the 20th century. The Turks who now live nearby scarcely know that their village once lay within the legendary world of the Trojan War. Yet the tumulus of Achilles remains, as described in the Odyssey, where Agamemnon tells his fallen comrade that the Argives raised a great mound on a jutting promontory by the wide Hellespont, so that it could be seen afar out on the water by men now alive and those to be born in the future. And so the Greeks of Anatolia, those who called their homeland Ikathimas Anatoli, our own Anatolia, continue to live on through memory, poetry, and the enduring landscapes that once bound two worlds together.